Tonight,
Oh my
we embark on a
God.
journey through
What is
10 of
that?
those intriguing files. These moments stand as testaments to instances when radar, flight crews, and trained witnesses intersected with phenomena they could not elucidate. Known as the NICAP files, they present a narrative that is calm, factual, and steeped in mystery. Let us delve into the Ellsworth AFB radar visual case from 1953 in South Dakota. I distinctly recall observing the radar's sweep as it unexpectedly turned back in on itself. Sergeant Ray Bockham frequently remarked that one does not anticipate a metal object manifesting a right angle on a radar screen. Bockham was not prone to hyperbole. Born in 1925 in Oklahoma, he served with the Army Air Forces during the concluding years of World War II before transitioning to the freshly established United States Air Force. By the time of the incident in 1953, he had ascended to the position of senior radar technician at Ellsworth Air Force Base, where his reputation for composure under duress and meticulous handling of instruments was well established. Consequently, when he reported an anomaly, his assertions bore considerable significance. On that clear evening across the Dakota Plains, the radar room was illuminated solely by the green glow of the screen. Shortly after 8 o'clock, Bockham discerned a solid return appear approximately 10 miles northeast of the base. The target was moving west-southwest at around 12,000 feet, exhibiting a steady and distinct trajectory. In mere moments, the object abruptly altered its course, maintaining both altitude and speed. Bockham meticulously verified his equipment and then alerted ground control intercepts stationed in Rapid City. Their radar corroborated the same return. Within a minute, a confirmation came from the Black Hawk station as well. Now, 3 disparate radar systems were tracking a singular object that exhibited behavior beyond the capabilities of any known aircraft. Ellsworth Command promptly ordered an intercept. At 8:12 p.m., 2 F-94C Starfire jets from the 54th Fighter Interceptor Squadron took off, directed toward the target. For a brief period, the onboard radar of the interceptors locked onto the object before contact was lost. Meanwhile, operators on the ground observed the unknown entity shift position, drawing close behind one of the jets. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Hale McClure communicated his situation, indicating he had a bogey on his 6 without any visual confirmation or tone. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the radar blip veered off to the north and vanished from every screen. Seconds later, the second pilot initiated radio contact to report he had a visible bright white light moving eastward, climbing vertically. His voice maintained steady cadence, although the sound of his breathing was unmistakable in the recording. Later, he disclosed to investigators that what he witnessed was neither a star nor another jet. The light ascended straight upward until it was no longer visible. Back in the radar room, the single echo bifurcated into 2 distinct signals. One remained strong, while the other faded into the background. The operator's log noted a possible electronic countermeasure signature originating from an unknown source. Outside the base, several witnesses had already turned their attention skyward. A truck driver traveling along the highway south of Rapid City witnessed a brilliant white light darting upward, leaving a fleeting vapor trail in its wake. 2 air police guards stationed at the munitions depot corroborated this account. One recounted that the event resembled a flare, except it did not plummet. Instead, it ascended and then disappeared. By 8:20 p.m., the radar screens once again displayed emptiness. Shortly thereafter, the interceptors returned to base, low on fuel. With the arrival of the morning shift, a technician observed that the magnetic compass atop the radar console had drifted approximately 15 degrees off its intended alignment overnight. This anomaly was corrected and recorded without further comment. Project Blue Book later reviewed the incident, filing its familiar conclusion on August 12th: unidentified, insufficient data. That could have marked the end of the narrative, yet Bockham's memory of the evening never waned. In the 1960s, when NICAP revisited Cold War radar cases, he provided a sworn statement emphasizing that the return he observed was indisputable. He stated they knew the distinction between weather interference and an actual target. This one was intentional. His original notebook, with its edges now yellowed, has survived the test of time. In the margin adjacent to the final entry, he inscribed the words "Visual confirmed." Air Force took film. The film, which had been automatically captured during the radar tracking, was extracted from Ellsworth just days later by visiting Air Force intelligence officials and has never been returned. A memo from Air Defense Command, dated August 7th and signed by Colonel G.H. Pritchard, confirmed the intercept and acknowledged the missing film. However, the document itself remained classified for many years. When NICAP's radar consultant, engineer Gordon Thier, scrutinized the data for UFO evidence in 1964, he estimated that the object's turn rate indicated an acceleration exceeding 15 times the force of gravity coupled with a climb rate approaching 40,000 feet per minute, far surpassing the known capabilities of aircraft from that era. They concluded that the target was indeed solid, with motion that was both controlled and deliberate. The Ellsworth incident was not an isolated event. During that same week, radar operators located in Fargo, North Dakota, and at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska recorded similar high-speed targets executing abrupt reversals and vertical ascents. Notably, 8 out of 11 radar visual reports documented within that month disclosed an identical pattern. Physicist James E. McDonald later characterized Ellsworth as one of the most technically secure radar visual cases of the Cold War era. 2 independent radar stations monitored the same object, and a military pilot witnessed it firsthand. The weather remained clear, and the instruments exhibited sound functionality. If one were to argue for the existence of physical craft under intelligent control in some UFO observations, McDonald posited that the Ellsworth case from 1953 would serve as a logical starting point. Bauckham eventually retired from the Air Force in the late 1960s, returning to Oklahoma, where he quietly resumed his work as an electronics technician. He seldom recounted the events of that fateful night. In his last recorded interview, he succinctly reflected, stating that they simply stared at the screen as it moved, appearing as if it possessed a life of its own. The official summary conveyed by the Air Force concluded with a solitary line. Object vacated the vertical plane. No sonic boom. No pursuit feasible. Each time I encounter this account, I am transported back to that dim radar chamber at Ellsworth. The steady hum of machinery, the soft illumination of the display, and the experienced airman monitoring a blip executing the unfathomable. For a brief moment on a pristine summer evening in 1953, an enigma floated above South Dakota, and it was Sergeant Ray Bauckham who first laid eyes upon it. In subsequent decades, the Ellsworth dossier evolved into a quietly significant element within NICAP's archives, not due to any sensationalist assertions, but rather for its technical merit. The radar readings, the concurrent visual confirmation, and the credible witnesses elevated it to one of the most robust cases ever documented by the organization. When the UFO findings were published in 1964, the Ellsworth incident was cataloged in the radar visual section as Case 2-3. The analysis underscored the acute accuracy of Bauckham's observation, alongside the confirmed collaboration between 3 radar installations. To engineers, it epitomized the ideal experimental case: clear weather, validated returns, and quantifiable performance that exceeded the limits of conventional aircraft. The classified memo from the Air Defense Command remained classified until the mid-1970s, when segments were discreetly declassified through Freedom of Information inquiries. The disclosed documents corroborated the intercept, the removal of the radar film, and the absence of any ensuing investigation. The memo failed to provide an explanation. Bauckham never sought the limelight. When approached by researchers in the latter part of the 1960s, he humbly identified himself as a technician, not a raconteur. He preserved his original notebook until his passing in 1987, later bequeathing it to a small aviation museum in Tulsa. The pages still exhibit the faint impression of his pencil's stroke beneath the word deliberate. For scholars examining that period, the Ellsworth case presents an exquisite paradox, completely documented, extensively witnessed, yet utterly unexplained. NICAP categorized it as radar visual multi-station confirmation object under intelligent control. At present, the file resides among hundreds of others from the early Cold War era, its edges frayed from repeated examination. Despite the passage of decades, that singular phrase from the Air Force summary continues to encapsulate the case. Object departed vertical. No chase feasible for NICAP. Yet, the inquiry was never truly about the pursuit. It revolved around the return, a solitary trace on a scope that turned abruptly against reason and disappeared into the annals of history. The Goshen County Nocturnal Encounter, Wyoming, 1956. I witnessed it rise over the ridge just above the fence line, Deputy Frank Myers recounted in later years. Initially, I assumed it was an aircraft in distress, but aircraft don't maneuver like that, and they certainly don't hover mid-air. Myers had served as a deputy sheriff in Goshen County, Wyoming for more than a decade. He was a reserved man, a veteran of the Korean War, and one of the few on the night shift who remained unflappable. His patrol route extended across the flat farmland surrounding Torrington, an expanse of alfalfa fields and low ridges where the horizon appeared boundless. He was intimately familiar with every dirt road and windmill, each light from every ranch house. Thus, when something unusual emerged in the sky that summer night, he instantly recognized it was outside the realm of the usual. It began as a distant glow to the east, a hazy yellow-white light hovering just above the fields. The atmosphere was tranquil, the radio silent. As Myers approached, the light expanded, sharpened, until it materialized into a smooth oval form, self-luminous, soundless, and hovering perhaps 100 feet above the terrain. It drifted slowly, gliding across a pasture with the grace of a helium balloon, yet there was no swaying, no audible presence, no shadow below it. He parked his patrol vehicle on the dirt road, shut off the engine, and strained to listen. Silence enveloped him, with only the sound of crickets chirping and the occasional lowing of cattle breaking the stillness. I stepped out and leaned against the door, who later told investigators. It felt as though it were alive, not soaring, merely existing. For nearly 1 minute, the object remained motionless before it began to shift again, ascending slightly and gliding northward across the expansive landscape. As it sailed over a line of cottonwoods, it cast a gentle bluish luminescence that illuminated the trees below. The cattle in a neighboring field began to stir, then suddenly panicked, their sudden unrest reverberating through the ground beneath Myers. A few moments later, his radio fell silent. Static crackled through the speaker, followed by an intense quiet. He attempted to restart the patrol car, but the ignition refused to turn. The dashboard lights flickered weakly before vanishing altogether. Myers later described sensing a tingling in the air as if the very atmosphere was charged. It felt as though the entire environment was buzzing, he remarked. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light intensified, angled skyward, and shot into the firmament. There was no sound, no rush of air, only a fleeting moment of motion so rapid it left a lingering afterimage in his vision. The vehicle's electrical system surged back to life immediately afterward. The headlights ignited by themselves, and the radio crackled back to life with faint conversations. He sat there in silence for several heartbeats before contacting dispatch, his voice calm yet uncertain regarding what he had just witnessed. Within an hour, another deputy arrived from Torrington to accompany him. Together, they scoured the area, discovering nothing out of the ordinary except for the unsettling behavior of the cattle, restless, sweating, and huddled against the far fence as if they had encountered something profoundly frightening. The ground beneath where the object had hovered felt slightly warm to his touch, despite the night air having cooled. Myers recorded the incident as unidentified aerial light, possibly indicating aircraft distress, though privately he confessed to his partner that he could not reconcile it with being an aircraft. In the following days, whispers of sightings trickled in from local farms. Several residents reported noting a brilliant oval light traversing the sky around the same time, moving silently northward. One woman mentioned that her radio had begun emitting peculiar bursts of static just prior to the power in her farmhouse dimming. None of them had detected the sound of engines. A regional newspaper ran a brief article titled "Deputy Reports Flying Light Over Torrington Fields," which subsequently garnered attention from the Associated Press wire, reaching NICAP investigators stationed in Washington. The case was assigned to researcher Robert Newcomb, a former radar technician who had joined NICAP's Wyoming group earlier that year. Newcomb traveled to Torrington, where he conducted an interview with Myers, inspected the patrol car, and collected soil samples from the area where the sighting occurred. His observations characterized the witness as composed, credible, yet hesitant to conjecture. Soil analysis revealed no radiation levels exceeding background norms, but the deputy's vehicle, a Ford patrol sedan, displayed minor pitting on the roof paint indicative of brief exposure to static discharge. Interestingly, the car's battery was replaced the following day due to an unexplained failure. NICAP's internal summary categorized the Goshen County report as a close encounter of the second kind, involving electromagnetic interference with tangible effects. It joined a mounting compilation of incidents in which vehicles stalled or electrical systems faltered in the presence of unidentified luminous phenomena. These patterns echoed scenarios familiar from the 1957 incidents in Leland, Texas, and earlier radar-correlated occurrences in the Midwest. During his investigation, Newcomb secured testimony from 2 personnel at a nearby power substation, both recalling a momentary voltage drop that same evening. Everything seemed to flicker for a second or two. One of them remarked that they had checked the gauges, detecting no faults, no lightning, and no discernible cause. These fleeting seconds aligned with the estimated timing of the deputy's encounter, as recorded in dispatch logs. Months later, Newcomb forwarded the completed report to NICAP headquarters, where it was cataloged under regional file number WY5617. 8 years after the incident, Richard Hall included it as a concise entry in the UFO evidence compilation. His summary succinctly stated that the deputy sheriff observed a glowing elliptical object close to the ground, coupled with vehicle and radio failures and independent confirmation of the power fluctuation. Over time, skeptics have proposed explanations ranging from ball lightning to misidentified aircraft, though neither explanation convincingly matched the details provided by the witness. Although ball lightning sometimes occurs silently, it rarely lingers for the duration reported and never maintains the consistent form and directional movement documented by various observers. Air traffic records for that night confirmed no aircraft were present within a 50-mile radius of Torrington, neither military nor civilian. When Myers eventually retired from law enforcement in the early 1970s, he occasionally fielded inquiries about the sighting. He would smile politely and deftly shift the conversation, but once, in a discussion with a local journalist, he confided that he didn't care what it was labeled. He was adamant, stating simply that it was not of this world. NICAP ultimately closed the file without a formal conclusion, yet the particulars continued to re-emerge in internal communications throughout the 1960s, often referenced as one of the earliest reliable cases demonstrating electromagnetics effects. For researchers, it represented a crucial link in the chain connecting visual UFO encounters to measurable interactions with vehicles and power systems. Decades later, when the archive boxes were reopened, the carbon copies of Myers' report still bore the faint scent of engine oil and dust. The handwriting remained steady, the description clinical yet almost indifferent: light, oval-shaped, self-luminous, hovering, motionless, car radio inoperative, cattle agitated. Beneath these details, he had inscribed a solitary line: object departed vertically. No sound. There is something disarming in the simplicity of those words. Lacking in speculation or wonder, they reflect a lawman meticulously documenting what he witnessed. On a silent Wyoming night, with the fields sprawling endlessly beneath the stars, a deputy encountered a light that seemed imbued with life. For a brief moment, every mechanism, including his car, his radio, and even the surrounding cattle, fell silent in its presence. In the ensuing weeks, the sheriff's department experienced a brief visit from 2 officers arriving from Cheyenne, who claimed to represent an air technical liaison. They collected the patrol car's malfunctioning battery along with the soil samples taken from the encounter site, pledging to forward their findings to the Air Force. However, no results were ever shared. The local newspaper published a singular follow-up article, largely skeptical, quoting a university meteorologist who proposed that plasma discharge under inversion conditions could explain the event. For Deputy Myers, the incident gradually faded into memory, yet his disbelief endured. He continued his service for another 15 years without any further incident, ultimately rising to the position of undersheriff before retiring to a modest ranch outside Lingley. When interviewed in the early 1980s by the Center for UFO Studies, he maintained his stance. He expressed that he had never witnessed anything like it again, yet he firmly believed in the reality of that night's sighting, asserting it was neither a storm phenomenon nor an aircraft. It was an entity that appeared out of place. The original NICAP file remained in storage until the organization's dissolution, at which point it was transferred to the UFO archives in Illinois. Within those archives, amid yellowed pages and faded photographs, the case quietly persists, standing as a haunting reminder of one man's encounter in an empty field and the silence that technology could not elucidate. The Redmond Bend sighting, Oregon, 1959, unfolds in a cockpit illuminated only by the thin white shimmer of moonlight adorning the horizon. Below, the high desert sprawled without end, tranquil and asleep. Captain Gerald Harper leaned forward in his seat, one hand on the yoke while the other shaded his eyes, gazing out past the right wing where a pale light lingered in the distance, remaining motionless. Initially, he considered the possibility of another aircraft, perhaps a private plane transversing their flight path. However, the light neither blinked nor altered its altitude. It hovered impossibly steady. "Traffic 2 o'clock?" his co-pilot queried, squinting at the anomaly. "Negative," Harper replied, reaching for the radio. "United 409, we have visual traffic off our right. Can you confirm?" The tower responded promptly. "United 409, no radar return in your area. Airspace is devoid of any traffic." Harper turned his gaze once more toward the light. It persisted, a silent, unwavering orb, mirroring their every movement in the sky. Gerald Harper had spent a lifetime in the cockpit. He had piloted bombers across the Pacific, a man acquainted with the fierce tracer fire, ferocious lightning, and meteors igniting the heavens. Post-war, he mastered the DC-3 on routes traversing the Northwest, where his only challenges were the relentless fog and treacherous mountain gusts. His peers deemed him fastidious. He was the type of pilot who assiduously recorded fuel usage out of sheer habit and meticulously folded maps with precision. Yet, that warm night in the summer of 1959, maps were the furthest thing from his mind. Instead, he was preoccupied with the inexplicable phenomenon, a light that effortlessly matched his aircraft's trajectory with an uncanny consistency, devoid of running lights, trailing exhaust, or any sound. He would later reflect on how he initially dismissed it as a mere reflection. However, with clouds too elevated to serve as a backdrop, the object mirrored their every maneuver, maintaining an eerily synchronized formation. Harper observed it inch closer, resolutely holding its position. In the subdued glow of the cockpit instruments, his co-pilot's face appeared ashen, a rigid mask of concern. "That thing's matching us," Captain Nelson remarked in a low voice. "It's keeping formation." As Harper executed a left bank, the object mirrored the maneuver without hesitation. It remained precisely hanging on the same wingtip, maintaining an identical distance. He sought to reach out again over the radio. Redmond reported clear skies, devoid of any radar indications. The air traffic controllers could not visually identify anything amiss either. Below them, in the stark tranquility of the Oregon night, more and more souls began to take notice. A rancher residing near Bend stepped outside to address a loose fence and recognized a faint disk of luminescence gliding soundlessly across the expanse above. He beckoned his wife, who perched beside him, and for nearly a minute they both observed as it ascended, leveled off, then hovered unnaturally still, all the while accompanied by the distant rumble of a plane. It appeared to be shadowing something, she later recounted to investigators. Meanwhile, Harper and Nelson were transfixed, witnessing that same light weave its intricate dance beside them in uncanny harmony. Harper seized his binoculars, a sturdy set he had cherished since the war, and steadied them against the affirmation of the cockpit. Through the crystalline lenses, its form became manifest, an oval shape, radiant, its edges soft and nebulous as if seen through a shimmering haze. It didn't merely reflect illumination, it seemed to emanate it. Then, abruptly, the light surged higher. It ascended vertically, Harper would say later, with no arc, no gradual ascent, merely straight up. It moved like a fleeting thought, present in one instant, vanished the next. The airspace around them became hollow. The cockpit expanded in eeriness, now filled only with the steady drone of engines and the rhythmic ticking of the gauges. Harper leaned back, ensnared in uncertain contemplation. He made a succinct notation in his logbook. Bright aerial object observed off right wing, no radar contact, behavior unknown. Upon landing the DC-3 in Portland, they were met by two official figures stationed near the gate. One represented the Civil Aeronautics Administration, while the other belonged to the Air Defense Command Detachment from Klamath Falls. They requested Harper's account of the incident before anyone else even disembarked. His report, rendered in tidy capital letters, was precise and straightforward. Self-luminous object, elliptical, devoid of running lights and silent engine noise, altitude estimated to be comparable with the aircraft. The object maintained an equal position before it departed vertically. The co-pilot appended his signature beneath. Both officials concurred to keep the matter discreet, but news inevitably permeated through the airline within mere days. It became referred to as Harper's Light by some, while others posited that it was merely an illusion forged by atmospheric conditions, a deceptive interplay of distance and reflection. Yet, 2 nights later, a Redmond Tower operator discerned an eerily similar phenomenon. While scanning the northern skyline, he caught sight of a stationary light hovering above the treetops, more radiant than any celestial body. He observed it for a span of nearly 3 minutes before it abruptly accelerated skyward and vanished. He documented a brief entry, but never conjoined it with the earlier sighting. Months later, NICAP investigators were not alerted to the Redmond Bend incident until a regional representative circulated Harper's and Nelson's reports. Analyst Walter Webb made his way to Oregon to interview both of them. He found Harper both composed and consistent, reluctant to theorize yet resolute in his recounting of the sighting. The accounts from both witnesses aligned perfectly, Webb noted. The behavior of the object suggested intelligent control. Both witnesses possessed considerable qualifications, with no evidence indicating misperception. He encountered ground witnesses whose testimonies synced with the reported trajectory and position of the flight, a rare triangulation. It was one of the clearest air visual cases to exist, Webb would later express to colleagues. Multiple observers, multiple elevations, and no radar return. Whatever the light was, it undeniably existed. Years later, when the Air Force declassified fragments of its internal communications, a solitary memo surfaced, dated September 3, 1959. It encapsulated the Redmond Bend observation in stark, terse language. Commercial aircraft reports of pacing light, no radar contact, optical mirage not excluded. That phrase, optical mirage not excluded, became a quiet source of frustration among civilian researchers. They comprehended it as the military's method of sidelining the unexplainable encounter. By the early 1960s, NICAP had cross-referenced that occurrence with numerous similar sightings recorded by airline crews in Idaho, Utah, and California, all recounting luminous objects maintaining close formation with their aircraft, always silent, always spiriting away vertically. Certain analysts suggested that, irrespective of the nature of these lights, they seemed to intentionally trace flight paths, almost as if they were observing from a close proximity. Harper never pursued public attention. When a Portland newspaper published a brief article characterizing it as a flying saucer event, he refrained from comment. He continued flying for several more years, preserving his reputation for steadfast professionalism. Yet, among fellow pilots, the tale endured. There was always a certain stillness in conversations when the topic shifted to unusual lights or objects traversing the sky, and inevitably, someone would lean in and say to inquire further about Harper. After all, he had witnessed it firsthand. His co-pilot, Nelson, transitioned from commercial aviation to Boise, where he took on the role of a flight instructor. Nestled within his pilot's license was a photocopy of his report, carefully folded. In the margin, a succinct note amplified the mystery. No sound, no reflection, a light that seemed to exhibit intent. When the New York Air Pilots Association was disbanded in the closing years of the 1970s, the Redmond Bend file, among others, found its new home with the Center for UFO Studies. The folder was modest, consisting of merely a handful of pages, but the handwriting displayed an admirable level of care, and the language remained measured. In the catalog, this case was succinctly classified under visual pacing of aircraft by luminous object, with clear disclaimers regarding radar presence and astronomical explanations. Researchers revisiting this file decades down the line discovered a fascinating alignment between the accounts of flight crew members and those on the ground, reaffirming the substance of the reports long after others had eroded with time. During one of his last interviews, conducted in an understated manner in 1977, Harper conveyed his observations with the same unwavering accuracy that defined his flight records. He firmly stated that it was neither Venus nor a figment of imagination. It maneuvered as though it were attuned to our actions. When they turned, it turned. When they ascended, it ascended. Then, with a grace that defied human engineering, it departed. The saga of the Redmond Bend sighting has crystallized into one of those lasting narratives, brief in timeline, yet rich in detail and curiously intimate in its human quality. A veteran pilot, a small-town control tower, and a handful of spectators beneath an expansive Oregon sky recounted the tale of a silent light that materialized, followed, and vanished without a trace of explanation. For several moments in the summer of 1959, a passenger aircraft glided alongside something that seemed to mirror conscious thought, adapting to every movement, perpetually eluding definition, leaving behind merely testimony and documentation. Then there was the incident at White Sands Range in New Mexico, occurring in 1957. One of the technicians whispered in amazement as he pointed out the radar return, noting that it was certainly not an aircraft. The radar room was designed for precision, where, on a typical evening, the air vibrated with a low hum and the rhythmic cadence of instruments faithfully measuring distance, speed, and time. Yet, this night in 1957 proved anything but typical. The luminous echo on the radar was stable, sharply defined, and traveling faster than anything ever recorded at the range. Chief Warrant Officer Ben Davis, supervising the shift, stood behind the console with his hands clasped, displaying the composure of a seasoned professional. At 41, he brought a wealth of experience from both combat and scientific observations, a radar specialist who had transitioned from serving in the United States Army Signal Corps in Europe to working with the Air Force's Missile Tracking Division. Colleagues who served under him claimed that Davis could interpret echoes simply by analyzing the contours of their curves. Half his life was spent scrutinizing phosphor screens, deciphering what others might dismiss as mere noise. However, this night, what he perceived did not resonate as noise at all. He instructed his operator to hold the gain steady, ensuring the return remained clear. The object had approached from the north, climbed, and then halted abruptly in the center of the monitor. Davis frowned, observing, concluding quietly that it represented solid material. The environment at White Sands in 1957 was meticulously controlled, with a detailed log of every aircraft and missile and thorough documentation of radar calibrations, leaving no room for randomness. That understanding set the stage for the peculiar sequences that followed. At another radar station 30 miles away, the identical target emerged at the same coordinates. Two independent systems, two distinct antennas, yet one object. Both instruments concurred. The contact was potent, rapidly moving, and evidently under intentional command. Davis reached for the phone to communicate with range control, announcing an unknown high-altitude maneuvering object not of their origin. The response was brief and measured, advising him to continue observations. For nearly a minute, the technicians monitored as the blip remained perfectly stationary at approximately 60,000 feet. Abruptly, it veered sharply to the east and accelerated beyond the radar's maximum recording capacity. The trace elongated, blurred, and ultimately disappeared from their screens. A hushed stillness enveloped the room, interrupted only by the gradual whir of cooling fans. As they replayed the radar tape, the movements were undeniable. A precise path that traversed the grid, paused, executed an instantaneous 90-degree turn, and vanished at speeds beyond their measuring equipment's capabilities. One of the operators speculated that it may have been some form of echo or glitch in the system. Davis, however, shook his head, asserting that echoes do not suddenly halt, nor do they execute turns. He took measures to have the film properly labeled and secured for later analysis. Within a day, 2 agents from Air Force Intelligence arrived at the range. Dressed in civilian attire and carrying inconspicuous briefcases, their inquiries were succinct, their demeanor courteous, and their objective unambiguous. They collected the film, calibration data, and even the handwritten logs. No one contested the procedure. It was merely an evaluation, as one of the younger technicians would recall later. However, once they departed, it was understood among the staff that they would never see that film again. A few weeks later, an official correspondence from Air Defense Command labeled the occurrence as a radar anomaly, suggesting it was likely a meteor reflection or atmospheric propagation. The explanation felt routine, like something pulled from a standard protocol template. For Davis, it felt like an affront. He had dedicated his career to identifying radar phenomena, and this episode did not fit that mold. Meteors do not hover, he emphasized to his team. Reflections don't make sharp angles. Life at the range resumed its usual tempo. Rockets were launched and recovered, telemetry data filled the filing cabinets, and discussions about the incident were confined to private conversations. Nevertheless, those who had been present that night retained a vivid recollection of the event. A few months later, during yet another missile test, 2 radar operators reported observing a similar unidentified object pacing a launch. That evening, a faint luminous entity was visually detected, moving parallel to the rocket's trajectory before it surged upwards. Range control dismissed the occurrence as mere coincidence, yet Davis remained unconvinced. He remarked, "We captured something genuine once. It's still out there." By the time NICAP learned about the 1957 incident, years had elapsed. Most of the original documentation had vanished, but 3 technicians, among them Davis, provided sworn statements to the organization. Each account recounted the same sequence of events: a solid radar return, abrupt directional shifts, a sustained hover, and then the object vanished at speeds exceeding known technology. Investigators from NICAP cross-referenced launch schedules and verified that no tests had taken place at that moment. The skies were clear and the radar systems were fully operational. The conclusion was straightforward. The object had been real, physical, and independent of any military undertakings. For the analysts in Washington, this case represented a rare synthesis of factors: trained observers, corroborative radar stations, and official suppression of primary evidence. The incident was noted in the 1964 UFO evidence report under radar visual correlation, White Sands Missile Range, 1957. It was a brief but significant entry, serving as a reminder that the most crucial data points often went overlooked by the authorities. Ben Davis retired from active service 2 years later and established his home in Colorado with his wife and 2 sons. Although he seldom discussed his tenure at White Sands, in a letter to a former colleague he mentioned, "The night the radar detected something the world was unprepared to acknowledge." The letter concluded with a striking line: "I don't know what it was, but it comprehended who we were." The men who had served under him remembered him as demanding yet fair, a technician who insisted on evidence rather than belief. If Ben declared it was real, one of his colleagues later told NICAP researchers that it was undeniably real. When military records from 1957 were subsequently examined under declassification, it revealed that the section relating to that range night was conspicuously absent. The radar film had been misfiled, and the calibration documents were said to have been destroyed during storage. No remnants of the data survived, yet the witnesses persisted, and their recollections remained consistent even decades later. One witness recounted that he could still visualize the trace in his mind, the bright sweep across the dark grid, the impossible halt, the vertical surge eastward. It was immaculate, he asserted, too immaculate to be mere noise. It felt as though something was present, demonstrating to them what it was capable of. For NYAP, the incident at the White Sands Range stood as quiet evidence that the phenomenon extended beyond just visual perception. It was measurable, recorded, and reproducible under controlled environments. It embodied a technical enigma in the purest form, observed by experts, documented by equipment, and obscured by procedure. Ultimately, what remains from that night is the memory of a select few. Radar operators in the desert remained vigilant, watching their instruments reveal a truth few were willing to accept. Above the desolate expanses of New Mexico, a solitary blip moved with intention across the radar scope, paused, and then vanished, leaving only silence, uncertainty, and the legacy of Chief Warrant Officer Ben Davis, a man who had seen enough to recognize it was not an error. The Bozeman Canyon sighting, Montana, 1959. Dr. Harold Ingram lowered his field notebook and followed his assistant's gaze across the ridge. Above the distant slope of Bozeman Canyon, a metallic shape hovered amid the afternoon haze, too stationary for a plane, too defined for a cloud. Initially, they speculated it might be a weather balloon. However, the light reflecting from its surface appeared incorrect. It shimmered like brushed aluminum with a subtle blue halo pulsating around its edges, radiating every few seconds. Ingram instructed his team to hold their compasses steady, suggesting they observe the object's behavior. The compass needle flickered, then veered nearly 20 degrees off north. Ingram, having been a geologist for 2 decades, had examined fault lines throughout the Rockies, documented seismic activity, and mapped mineral deposits for the state university. A man of precision, he carried 2 compasses, a folding transit, and an aging Leica camera with him everywhere he went. His students often teased that he relied on his instruments more than on his own eyes. That day, accompanied by 2 graduate assistants, Daniel Ross and Ellen Weaver, they ventured into the canyon to gather soil samples along the Madison Formation. The late summer air felt dry and cool, with thin cirrus clouds trailing above the peaks. Their instruments were laid out across the hood of the Jeep when the object appeared. "It's holding steady," Ross remarked, adjusting his binoculars. "No movement whatsoever." Through the lenses, the craft appeared oval, almost domed, not perfectly symmetrical, but seamlessly smooth with no markings, no tail, and no discernible rotation. It emitted no sound. Weaver shielded her eyes against the light. "Perhaps it's a helicopter," she ventured. Ingram shook his head. "At this altitude, that's improbable. Observe the corona. That's ionization, not exhaust." They watched in silence as the object remained motionless above the ridge, its glow fluctuating gently like the pulse of an engine just beneath perception. The surrounding air shimmered as though distorted by heat, despite the mild temperature. When Ingram attempted another compass reading, the deviation persisted, nearly 20 degrees from true north. It was not a fleeting magnetic anomaly. The error remained constant until the object initiated movement. And when it did move, it was instantaneous. The craft tilted subtly, intensified in brightness, and then propelled westward across the canyon, covering several miles in an instant before halting above another ridge. Weaver gasped in astonishment while Ross hastily set aside the binoculars. "I didn't see it cross," Ross stammered. "It was simply present in one moment and then gone in the next." Ingram braced his notebook against the fender of the Jeep, jotting down compass bearings and estimating angles with intense focus. "Direction 285, he murmured under his breath. Altitude remained constant, acceleration surpassing what optical tracking could capture. Moments later, the enigmatic object began to rise slowly, climbing into the refracting haze until it eventually vanished from view. The entirety of the encounter unfolded in less than 3 minutes. Upon returning to the university that evening, Ingram meticulously documented the incident in his field report. The writing was factual, precise, and devoid of sensationalism. He chronicled the sighting of a domed metallic entity of indeterminate origin, noting its luminous corona and its observable electromagnetic influence. He appended compass readings, temperature assessments, and 3 rudimentary sketches of the object. His assistant affixed their signature to the report as witnesses. The narrative could have concluded there, another anomaly inked in a geologist's notebook, yet the report transitioned to the physics department on campus and was subsequently forwarded in hushed tones to the State Civil Defense Office. In less than 2 weeks, it found its way to NICAP headquarters, nestled in Washington, D.C. NICAP investigator Robert Powell journeyed to Montana to interview the witnesses firsthand. He found Ingram to be reserved yet accommodating, asserting that we are scientists and do not leap to conclusions. However, Powell pointed out that the phenomenon observed did not align with any occurrences he had previously encountered in nature or aviation. Powell visited the site accompanied by a local sheriff's deputy, where they discovered the soil remained undisturbed, but the magnetic deviation was still measurable, faintly detectable across a narrow expanse approximately 50 feet wide. This unusual effect dissipated 3 days later. Within the scientific community, the report circulated quietly. Some colleagues dismissed it as an atmospheric inversion, sunlight reflecting off ice crystals, yet others struggled to reconcile the movement they had witnessed. A particular meteorologist who reviewed Ingram's findings privately noted that the described acceleration defied explanation as mere optical illusion. What piqued NICAP's interest was the amalgamation of credible witnesses and measurable physical effects. Ingram and his team had no reason to fabricate their observations, and the degree of detail in their documentation was unusually high. The compass deviation hinted at electromagnetic interference, a pattern that NICAP had recognized in other incidents dating back to the 1950s, such as those in Leland, Texas, and White Sands, New Mexico. Powell concluded the Bozeman case in his final report. 3 trained geologists witnessed a domed metallic structure exuding self-luminosity and exhibiting magnetic influence while maneuvering in a manner inconsistent with aerodynamics. No sound or visible propulsion was observed, and the duration of the sighting was roughly 3 minutes. The witnesses were deemed credible, but the object remained unidentified. Years later, Ingram's students would recall his reluctance to address the incident publicly. Whenever he did mention it, his tone remained measured, and his language was deliberate. "We observed something structured," he once recounted in a seminar, emphasizing that it possessed form, motion, and silence, 3 attributes that rarely coexist. Weaver, the graduate assistant, remembered the peculiar tranquility that enveloped the group during the sighting. "It was not a frightening experience," she remarked, but rather captivating. "You couldn't look away, and it felt as though it was aware of our presence." Ross, who later pursued a career in mining engineering, kept one of Ingram's sketches tucked away inside a drawer for years. He recounted that every glance at it rekindled the electric stillness he experienced that afternoon, where the air vibrated with silent energy. When NICAP published the UFO evidence in 1964, the Bozeman Canyon sighting was featured as a brief entry under Category 2, Physical Effect with Scientific Witnesses. It stated that 3 university geologists observed a domed metallic object hovering over the ridge near Bozeman Canyon, Montana. A compass deviation of 20 degrees was recorded. The object emitted a pulsing blue corona and departed instantaneously. The witnesses were regarded as credible, though at Ingram's behest, his name was withheld and listed only as University Professor of Geology, Montana. For many years, researchers sought the original field notes, but the university archives had no record of them. Some speculated that visiting Air Force personnel discreetly removed the notes in the early 1960s. In the 1970s, a retired weather officer named Paul Mackenzie corresponded with NICAP, claiming to have been on duty at a nearby radar installation on the day of the incident. His letter detailed a brief but intense radar return north of the range. The altitude remained indeterminate, and its duration was under 30 seconds. The timing and positioning roughly aligned with Ingram's observations. Mackenzie stated he had been instructed not to log it. If true, this would represent the only radar corroboration of the encounter. NICAP filed the letter, but could never verify its authenticity. Still, it resonated with what Ingram and his assistants had witnessed. A tangible object, under control, performing maneuvers that no known aircraft could replicate. By the time Ingram retired in 1974, he had ceased entertaining inquiries about the case. In an interview with a local publication, he addressed it one last time. "Science commences with observation. We observed something. We could not explain it then, nor can we do so now. However, that does not diminish its reality." Weaver later recounted a visit to the site many years later. The ridge had undergone changes, adorned with new trees and fences, yet the sense of isolation persisted. "When I stood there," she reflected, "I was transported back to how still it had been, as if the air itself was attuned to listen." Within NICAP's archives, the file on Bozeman Canyon remains sparse, consisting of a few photocopied statements, a map, a compass reading, and a typewritten note penned by Robert Powell. It emerged as one of the most rigorously documented witness accounts encountered, devoid of embellishment. Despite its brevity, the case has become a reference point frequently cited in discussions about scientific witnesses, professionals trained to measure and articulate, not to sensationalize. Attuned to listen. For NYAP, it embodied an occurrence that bestowed credibility upon the phenomenon, marked by the serene and empirical observations of those seasoned in the art of measurement. To this day, the Bozeman Canyon sighting remains one of the most understated yet accurate accounts in the annals of UFO history. A singular moment when three scientists, positioned in a canyon of contorted stone under the late summer sun, beheld something that defied reason yet left behind clues too precise to be dismissed. Years later, when reflecting on that pivotal night, Ingram did not mention the object that had drawn their gaze. Instead, he recalled the compass needle, betraying all established laws as it drifted, then held steady. That, he remarked, was the instant of realization that they were no longer merely measuring the Earth, they were probing something beyond comprehension. The Hobbs Airliner Encounter. New Mexico, 1963. The radar room at Albuquerque Center was perpetually vigilant, its dim illumination casting soft green hues upon the walls. The pulse of the radar antenna cut through the silence like a rhythmic heartbeat. On nights when the air traffic was minimal, the gentle hum of consoles morphed into a distinct form of stillness, a dialect understood only by air traffic controllers. Among these dedicated professionals was John Alvarez, a 37-year-old radar specialist who had committed much of his adult life to interpreting the sky, deciphering dots and echoes. Having joined the Air Force as a radar technician during the Korean War, Alvarez learned to detect movement patterns, much like others discern patterns in the wind. He later transitioned to the Federal Aviation Agency, contributing to the expansion of civil radar across the Southwest. Colleagues characterized him as meticulous and deliberate, a man whose trust lay more in established procedures than in instinct. Having encountered false returns, equipment noise, and even electronic interference from high-altitude tests, he knew all too well how to distinguish between a mere ghost and a tangible target. On that fateful night in 1963, his sector over southeastern New Mexico was serene. The lone westbound flight, Transwestern 212, a DC-6 en route to Los Angeles, traversed the map unhurriedly, its blip appearing vivid and steady against the phosphor screen. Every detail of the flight unfolded ordinarily until the captain reported an unexpected presence. The transmission remained calm, clipped, and thoroughly professional. The crew cited the presence of a luminous object allegedly shadowing them off the right wing, maintaining the same altitude but lacking strobes or navigational lights. Alvarez scrutinized the radar scope, noting that only the anticipated return was visible. He adjusted the gain, altered the range, and tinkered with the filters. For a fleeting moment, nothing seemed to shift. Then, faintly, a secondary trace emerged alongside the first, small, refined, and impeccably aligned. He froze, riveted as he observed the 2 points traversing the sweep in tandem. They were separated by approximately 10 miles, hurtling along at an equal speed and in the same direction. The second echo displayed remarkable stability, devoid of the flickering that often characterized atmospheric anomalies. It maintained its position for several rotations before fading into obscurity. Alvarez made a careful mark on the plotting chart, logging the coordinates with precision. Moments later, the faint trace reappeared, positioned slightly ahead of the airliner, only to vanish once again. He had encountered radar illusions in the past, triggered by temperature layers that distorted signals or ground reflections bouncing off distant elevations, but this experience diverged fundamentally from such occurrences. The coherence and intentionality of the signal were striking. He kept his report succinct and to the point. Unidentified secondary return, short duration, correlated with pilot visual. The event unfolded over the course of roughly 10 minutes. The pilot continued to report on the light still within view, maintaining its formation. Alvarez documented each update with quiet diligence. When the final transmission came through, the object had rapidly surged ahead of the aircraft before ascending out of sight. At that very moment, the radar trace dissipated. After the airliner exited his sector, the screen reverted back to its customary tranquility. A few languid returns from commercial flights scattered across hundreds of miles reflected in the radar, nothing in proximity to the coordinates he had so carefully noted. He concluded his shift without further comment. The following morning, as he evaluated the radar film, each antenna sweep recorded on 16mm stock for playback revealed the elusive secondary return once more. It appeared faint yet substantive, mirroring the path of the DC-6 before shooting upward and disappearing. The trace left a distinctly sharp line, too defined to be dismissed as mere noise and too abrupt for a reflection. Alvarez forwarded the reel along with his notes to the regional office for the standard evaluation, anticipating the customary circular explanation that typically followed such inquiries. Weeks later, the response arrived. No corroborating radar data confirmed. Possible optical misidentification or astronomical phenomena were suggested. That was the last official communication he received. To most controllers, it represented an inconsequential event, a mere entry among the extensive list of unidentified phenomena that filled the nightly logs of the 1960s. Yet, for Alvarez, it lingered on like an unresolved melody. The data had been too precise, the pilot too credible, and the radar too accurate to disregard lightly. He maintained a private notebook, a customary practice among controllers, where he meticulously logged anomalies and technical irregularities for personal study. His entry for that night was succinct yet pointed. Parallel target accompanying westbound commercial flight, no transponder, no return from secondary station, behavior suggesting control rather than reflection. He never revealed the note to anyone. Years later, as investigators from the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena commenced their cataloging of pilot encounters with corroborating ground data, his name unexpectedly surfaced in their records. They approached him discreetly through FAA channels. Alvarez consented to share his recollections on background, yet requested that his name remain undisclosed in any published materials. He recounted the double return, the synchronized movement, and the clean vertical ascent, emphasizing that the radar had been calibrated, the atmospheric conditions stable, and no other air traffic had been present within a 60-mile radius. One of the investigators, a gentle-voiced former Air Force engineer, inquired whether he had ever witnessed anything akin to that since. Alvarez contemplated for a moment before acknowledging that no encounter had mirrored that one. It seemed as if the object possessed an awareness of its surroundings. The final summary from the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena was succinct. Crew members from a commercial airline reported observing a luminous disk that kept pace with their aircraft near Hobbs, New Mexico. Ground radar corroborated this with echoes that aligned perfectly with the object's position. Then, it ascended vertically at an astonishing speed. The witnesses were credible, and yet the case remained unresolved. Once the Air Force received the report through the Project Blue Book channels, it was downgraded to a generic classification, insufficient data, labeled as astronomical optical. Notably, the radar evidence was excluded from discussions at the Albuquerque Center. The incident quietly faded into the background, becoming a reference point whispered among radar technicians during the monotonous night shifts, their screens dark and coffee lukewarm. At those times, the Hobbs echo would surface in conversation, and Alvarez would typically respond with a casual shrug, offering little insight. The film had been captured, the data dismissed, and life continued on. Nevertheless, he often found himself reflecting on the object's precise movements, particularly how that faint trace remained meticulously aligned with the airliner for several minutes before it abruptly shot off the grid. Such motion was no accident. By the late 1960s, as civilian UFO organizations began clamoring for increased transparency, the Hobbs encounter found itself revisited in correspondences and briefings. Analysts from the Civil Aeronautics Administration pointed out that it represented an extraordinary instance of simultaneous confirmation via radar and visual observation by the pilot under clear atmospheric conditions. For them, it served as a critical case, a technical event that could not simply be dismissed as a figment of perception. In 1970, a researcher compiling radar case studies reached out to Alvarez again. Yet, he maintained his stance of anonymity, having long since moved to the Denver Center, where advanced radar systems showcased clearer returns and employed digital overlays. Still, he retained vivid memories of that night. For him, the analysis was straightforward, he confided to the researcher. Simple, yet impossible. Presently, the remaining documentation concerning the Hobbs airliner incident amounts to 3 fragments: a page from the nightly log, a brief segment of the radar film preserved in microfiche, and the pilot's official incident report. Everything else, including calibration records, raw film reels, and communications between the Federal Aviation Administration and Air Defense Command, was marked for disposal after review. For John Alvarez, that event represented a quiet benchmark in his professional journey. He retired in 1976, his service record noting 22 years of commendable performance. Tucked away among his belongings, nestled between training manuals and flight charts, lay a photocopy of the NICAP summary, where he had underlined a specific sentence: radar set in calibration at time of observation. He refrained from publicly speculating about the nature of the object. Years later, when approached by a local journalist gathering oral histories on Cold War radar operations, he provided a tempered response. The screen does not fabricate illusions. It displays motion, distance, and shape. Whatever that entity was, it moved intentionally. That was all he articulated. For the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, the Hobbs case remained one of the understated technical enigmas that filled its archives. Lacking drama and exaggeration, it recorded the observations of trained individuals and data that defied conventional explanations. It illustrated the tension between evidence and official recognition, highlighting how unequivocal radar confirmations could dissipate under the weight of bureaucratic denial. Even decades later, researchers revisiting the files have identified it as one of the cleanest radar visual pairings documented, not due to any spectacle, but rather its simplicity. It was a moment when professional instruments and skilled eyes concurred on something that the broader system was ill-prepared to accept. And within that subdued radar room, long before the data had dispersed into the morass of bureaucracy, a solitary line of light had revealed to John Alvarez a truth he could never articulate fully. Something was flying alongside that airliner, maintaining perfect pace before vanishing into the sky without a trace. The Wanakee Reservoir phenomenon unfolded in New Jersey in 1966. The night air over northern New Jersey had become frigid. The Wanakee Reservoir lay beneath a rigid layer of ice, and the ridges surrounding it stood in silence, cloaked in darkness. In the valley towns, rooftops sparkled with frost. It appeared to be an ordinary winter evening until a radiant blue light emanated over the water. Patrolman Joseph Chirigliano was the first to report the sighting. He had parked his cruiser along the roadside near the reservoir's southern dam when he observed a pale beam slicing through the dense mist. It was not the steady beam of a searchlight. Rather, it appeared to pulsate as if it were probing the surface of the frozen water. On his dashboard microphone, Chirigliano's report was straightforward: bright blue-white light over reservoir moving with irregular motion. In mere moments, the police switchboard was inundated with calls. Residents from the hillside and a firefighter stationed at the Wanka station, along with the dam's caretaker, reported similar observations, all describing a brilliant light source that glided soundlessly and illuminated the ice below with a shimmering halo. From then on, what had been a serene night for the town morphed into a controlled chaos. Squad cars surged toward the reservoir, their engines reverberating across the valley. A small gathering formed on the access road, pulled in by curiosity and the peculiar glow radiating through the fog. In the reports that followed, witnesses differed in their descriptions of the object's movement. Some asserted it drifted gracefully, while others insisted it darted with the rapidity of a flame caught in the wind. Yet, unanimously, they agreed on the color: an intense blue-white light that flickered across the ice, casting elongated shadows from the dam's sturdy concrete towers. Officer Richard Hennessy, who joined Chirigliano, later remarked that the beam appeared to search the reservoir in sweeping arcs, pausing momentarily as if it were focusing on specific locations. When he emerged from the car, he sensed an alteration in the air, a peculiar warmth that felt out of place on a night plagued by the freezing chill. Nearby, Fire Chief John Casadza had also been alerted to the anomaly. From his elevated position on the hill, he surveyed the entire northern sector of the reservoir, drenched in the mesmerizing blue radiance. He later remarked that it resembled a spotlight beaming down from an invisible source, though conspicuously, no discernible path of light directed toward it. The illumination seemed to linger in the air, described by witnesses as round, bright in the core, with an indistinct, hazy perimeter. Some speculated it was stationary, while others insisted it glided effortlessly from ridge to ridge, hovering momentarily above the crystalline surface of the frozen water. When it finally dimmed, the ensuing darkness felt more oppressive, heavy with a sense of absence. Initially, the police approached the occurrence as a potential public safety concern. Control of the reservoir's grounds rested with the municipality, precluding unauthorized aerial vehicles from encroaching upon the area. Notifications were dispatched to Newark Airport and McGuire Air Force Base, both of which confirmed they had no aircraft in operation over Wanakee. One officer sought corroboration from the Civil Defense Office, which relayed the inquiry to the Federal Aviation Agency. No radar contacts were recorded that corresponded with the specified time or location of the events. As the clock struck midnight, the light reappeared. This time, it graced multiple towns, including Haskell and Ringwood, even illuminating the valley from Pompton Lakes. Residents stepped onto their porches and into driveways, transfixed by a luminous sphere gliding slowly across the frost-bitten terrain. The police switchboard registered over 50 calls within a single hour. Several witnesses recounted seeing the light as the size of a car drifting just above the treetops before it unexpectedly shot upwards and disappeared into the night sky. A particularly vivid account emerged from Officer Thomas Dway, stationed on the eastern side of the dam. He noted that the beam appeared to warm the ice in patches where it lingered. The following morning, crews verified the existence of small, irregular holes in the frozen surface, each one roughly circular, marked by thin, glazed edges, suggesting they had been momentarily subjected to intense heat. Photographs taken by local residents depicted nothing but vague, luminous blurs, overexposed streaks against a backdrop of darkness. Yet, even in their crude form, the images corresponded closely to the descriptions provided by witnesses, definitively an isolated light source rather than merely a reflection from a conventional spotlight. For the ensuing weeks, the narrative reverberated throughout the region. Local newspapers ran sensational headlines like "Police Spot Blue UFO over Wanakay" and "Reservoir Patrolman Claims Beam of Light Melts Ice." Municipal officials speculated wildly, citing everything from pranksters wielding industrial lamps to distant searchlights misjudged through mist. However, the considerable distances involved left those theories unconvincing. The landscape surrounding the reservoir was insulated by hills, thwarting any line of sight applicable to such equipment. When representatives from NICAP arrived later that month, they were met with an unexpected degree of cooperation from the witnesses. Setting this case apart from many UFO inquiries, it involved law enforcement officers who had meticulously filed contemporaneous written reports. Over 60 statements were compiled, replete with sketches and temperature readings. The data revealed localized heat irregularities on the ice, showing surface temperatures several degrees warmer than the surrounding frozen expanse. Investigators documented compass deviations at 2 observation sites adjacent to the dam, implying a fleeting electromagnetic disturbance. Despite no indications of interference with ignition or radio systems in patrol vehicles, the added variable coupled with the existing evidence shrouded the event in further mystery. The official documentation from that winter read like a series of measured responses. Patrolmen followed up on public calls, while the fire department assessed safety protocols. Civilian agencies communicated progress up the chain of command. It never exuded the scent of panic, only a compulsion to understand bound by procedural limitations. However, the tone captured in the eyewitness accounts bestowed a different atmosphere. They reflected a quiet disbelief from officers accustomed to identifying every aerial light: aircraft, weather balloons, flares. The reservoir officers documented their observations diligently, steering clear of hyperbole. Yet the undertones conveyed an essence of astonishment. A particular line in one officer's statement resonated deeply, asserting that the light seemed aware of their presence. Such a phrase seldom appears in official documentation. It did not imply a threat or advanced intelligence, rather a simple acknowledgement that somehow the beam responded, as though it hesitated when their gazes met. NICAP's investigators categorized the Wanak incident under multi-observer ground visual electromagnetic correlation. They stressed the unusual nature of the case: police, firefighters, and civilians all recounting the same hue, the same positioning, and the same abrupt vanishing act. The concluding report determined that no standard explanation could satisfactorily account for the observations. It urged for further atmospheric and optical assessment, acknowledging that the thermal phenomena involving the ice defied rudimentary physical principles. The Air Force's Project Blue Book assessed the incident through standard procedural channels, concluding in March 1966 that it likely stemmed from reflections or refractions from a terrestrial light source interacting with fog and icy conditions. No additional investigation was warranted. To those who had witnessed the event, that resolution seemed like a habitual dismissal. The fog on that night was light, the hills too steep to allow for reflected beams, and the ice steadfast enough to resist mirages. Yet, that proclamation was definitive. Decades on, the Wanak file remains one of NICAP's most extensive community analyses. The sheer volume of consistent police testimonies, each independently documented, lends the case a significance rarely seen in civilian UFO reports. The scant physical evidence, while minimal, had been meticulously cataloged. Circular openings in the ice, temperature discrepancies, and diagrams illustrating a luminous object hovering soundlessly, approximating the size of a small vehicle. No individual observer accurately rendered the specifics of the structure or surface of the phenomenon. The light itself seemed to captivate researchers, amplifying the mystery surrounding it. It was, in essence, not a craft in the conventional definitions, but rather something that appeared to possess agency, moving with a purposeful intent. Today, the old dam road remains a lifeline across the reservoir, and the police station that once fielded numerous calls stands resilient, although its radio room is far quieter now. On some winter nights, fog rolls in over the frozen expanse, bathed in the same ethereal glow reminiscent of that January evening. The tale has dissipated into the fabric of local lore, teetering between mere rumor and civic myth. Encased within the archives of the NICAP report, the final page reveals a handwritten note tucked in the margin, penned years after the initial investigation by one of the field agents. Case listed as unexplained. The witnesses comprised professionals, thermal data was validated, and yet no origin for the light was identified. Beneath this brief account lay another, smaller annotation, potentially from the same hand. All concurred. It was beautiful. The phenomenon at Wanakay Reservoir persists, not merely as a technological enigma, but as a shared moment of profound stillness, a small community entwined in disbelief beneath a common beam of light. Civilians and officers stood together in the biting cold, their exhalations rising in a mist into the frigid air, watching something that emitted no sound and left behind only melted ice and a collective assurance of having witnessed it. Simultaneously, for NICAP, it stood as an exemplary instance of authentic observation, an event chronicled by individuals with no desire for validation, solely focused on documenting what they had experienced. The report concluded in the manner characteristic of their most compelling cases, devoid of speculative theories and lacking resolution, leaving only the imagery that initiated it all. A serene blue glow gliding silently over the frostbitten water, accompanied by the question that never thawed with the ice, the pursuit across Idaho Falls. Idaho, 1967. The roads heading east from Idaho Falls lay desolate that night, save for the blanket of snow and the continuous hum of tires on the icy surface. Sheriff's Deputy Marion Hale navigated the route alone, patrolling the two-lane roadway that traced the contour of the river as it climbed toward the foothills. He had traversed this path countless times, a journey that devolved into a familiar cadence rather than a mere destination. The radio on his dashboard emitted a low static hum until suddenly, there it was, the light. Initially, it manifested in his rearview mirror, an orange orb rising from behind a ridge, luminous enough to make the chrome accents inside the cruiser glimmer. Hale surmised it was an aircraft preparing to approach the municipal landing field. Yet, it failed to ascend. It trailed the roadway. Slowing his cruiser, he observed as the glow neared, steady and silent. It maintained its distance, neither overtaking nor receding. He activated his microphone to notify dispatch, detailing the round orange light trailing him at a low altitude. The operator acknowledged his call, relaying his report across the rural communication network. Within moments, 2 additional deputies from neighboring counties confirmed they too had witnessed the same object, each describing it as bright, smooth, and utterly soundless. The pursuit commenced, though they had yet to designate it as such. Having served in law enforcement for nearly a decade, Hale had encountered reflections from farm equipment, meteors, and even the bright flare of a military test overhead. However, this was distinct. It mirrored his every movement, adjusting flawlessly to his turns. When he came to a halt, it decelerated. When he pressed the accelerator, it kept pace, maintaining perfect formation just above the power lines, tracking east toward the open expanse. The light trailed him, holding its altitude, occasionally veering slightly aside as if examining him. Lacking any beams, tails, or strobes, it presented merely as a sphere, orange at the core and fading to a pale rim that ebbed into the night. At the county boundary, he encountered Deputy Ray Dunnar, who had been listening in on the same frequency. They parked their vehicles side by side, stepping into the biting cold together. The silence enveloped them. The typical sounds of the highway vanished. Both men stood beside their cruisers, gazing upward as the object glided above. It emitted no noise whatsoever. Hale described it afterward as being comparable in size to a small aircraft, although devoid of wings or fuselage, merely light pulsating in slow, deliberate waves. As it moved directly overhead, both of their radios fell silent. The dispatch center's recordings captured the moment of disruption, a sudden surge of static, then profound silence. For nearly 30 seconds, all communication channels from the patrol units fell silent. When the signal re-established, the deputies were shouting fragmented transmissions, confirming their engines had faltered momentarily, but had not stalled. The object ascended swiftly and was soon out of sight. Back at headquarters, the night dispatcher made a note by hand, indicating the temporary loss of radio contact with units east of Idaho Falls coincided with reports of an aerial light. NICAP investigators later underscored that sentence in red. Over the following hour, the object materialized repeatedly across the valley. Residents on the peripheral farm roads phoned in reports of a fireball gliding low across the fields. One truck driver along Route 33 noted that it matched his rig's speed for approximately 2 moments before darting upward as though pulled by an unseen force. Another witness, a local radio host who happened to be testing his transmitter, reported that the signal meter spiked coincidentally as the bright luminary surged overhead. By dawn, the light had vanished. Deputy Hale submitted his incident report at the end of his shift. The document, while concise and cautious, read, "Observed luminous spherical object exhibiting parallel motion with patrol vehicle, approximate altitude 300 to 500 feet, duration of observation 20 minutes, object departed. Vertically at high velocity." No sound or structure was noted. He refrained from mentioning the haunting feeling that lingered thereafter, the sense that the object had been aware of him, adjusting with intent alongside him. Off the record, he confided in a friend, explaining it felt as though curiosity itself was trailing him. Within days, NICAP's Northwest Field Office initiated an investigation, procuring recordings from the sheriff's dispatch, weather data, and witness testimonies from 7 civilians scattered throughout a 30-mile radius. No scheduled aircraft or weather balloons were detected in the vicinity. Meteorological conditions remained stable, characterized by clear skies devoid of inversion or atmospheric refraction that could sustain light at such altitudes. Investigators documented the electromagnetic interference noted by both patrol cars. The brief interruption in radio communications corresponded almost precisely with the period of visual observation. Upon inspection the following day, one of the vehicles, a Ford Cruiser equipped with an early transistor system, exhibited slight compass deviation. No mechanical issues were identified. The case file expanded rapidly, filled with photocopied maps marked in pencil, radar plots showing no returns, and handwritten accounts from ordinary citizens narrating extraordinary calm. Every witness concurred on one crucial detail. The object moved with deliberate intent. Hale avoided drawing attention to the incident. He granted a brief interview to a local newspaper, but opted out of appearing on camera when television crews from Salt Lake City arrived. He merely stated that they saw what they saw, reiterating that it was all he would disclose. Postscripts of that evening echoed in his mind, vivid yet haunting. He expressed that what disturbed him the most was not the light itself, but rather the surrounding silence, how the night felt utterly devoid of sound when the object drew near. It was akin to the world holding its breath, he noted. Alan Gross, the lead investigator and a former physicist, meticulously recorded in his summary that the witness demonstrated substantial credibility, lacking any history of exaggeration or confusion. The description aligned with structured illumination, exhibiting clear control. The case was classified as a close encounter too, highlighting an electromagnetic correlation. Gross subsequently cited the Idaho Falls pursuit in his 1968 report to NICAP headquarters, recognizing it as one of the most lucid law enforcement encounters documented. When the Air Force examined the evidence through its liaison program, its analysis was, as expected, succinct. The assessment declared it likely of astronomical origins, possibly a bolide or atmospheric plasma. However, such phenomena do not maintain altitude, nor do they match the pacing of vehicles or disrupt radio signals. Confidentially, several FAA technicians who scrutinized the dispatch recordings conceded that they had no precedents for synchronized visual and communication disruptions that spanned such durations. A memo etched in pencil in the margins of a typed document within the NICAP archives read, "Pattern suggests directed energy or electrical coupling event." However, no follow-up appeared subsequent to that notation. In the years that followed, Hale continued patrolling the same routes, yet he never encountered the light again. When prompted later about it, he recounted it, devoid of embellishment, as an orange sphere, silent, inquisitive, and fleeting. His report remained one of the scant police documents in Idaho that were officially shared with NICAP prior to the organization's decline in the 1970s. The tangible evidence was non-existent. The sole discernible residue was the radio interference maintained on magnetic tape, which continues to exist within private collections. When played in present times, it manifests as a faint rush of static, the precise moment when communication dissolved into a void of silence. For a few fleeting seconds, the tape captures nothing. No voices, no sounds before the channel abruptly restores, now laden with a cacophony of overlapping transmissions and palpable tension. Those moments crystallized into the heart of the case, a testament to the existence of something that lingered, if only for that heartbeat of silence. Within NICAP's internal catalog, the Idaho Falls pursuit was classified under Vehicle Interaction Electromagnetic Effects. It joined a select assembly of cases wherein engines or radios faltered in proximity to unidentified aerial lights. Investigators noted the professionalism exhibited by the witnesses, the absence of hysteria, and the consistency in their observations. For the engaged deputies, the incident receded into an elusive memory, too bizarre to dismiss, yet too distinct to rationalize. In the 1980s, the sheriff's department relocated, yet remnants of the old radio room persisted, with faint scrolls of call numbers lingering on the wall where the dispatch board had once been mounted. Someone had inscribed the date of the encounter in chalk, encircling it, marking 1967 before the wall succumbed to fresh paint. Years later, after Hale's retirement, a journalist inquired if he ever uncovered the truth behind what he had witnessed. He reflected for an extended moment, then remarked that sometimes one could pursue something relentlessly without ever capturing it, while still knowing it remained real. Ultimately, the Idaho Falls pursuit emerged as a case laden with silence, the silence of the radio, the quietude of the object itself, and the institutional silence that ensued. For NICAP, it served as yet another concrete illustration of how effortlessly tangible evidence could vanish into mere explanations. The reports delineated every measurable aspect, angles, durations, temperatures, yet overlooked the most human element, the sensation of being observed from just beyond the headlight's glare. Out there, on that desolate Idaho highway, beneath a starlit sky that had swallowed sound, a faint orange light once kept pace with a sheriff's car for 20 minutes, maintaining an impeccable distance before ascending into the night. In Cherry Creek Landing, New York, during 1965, he believed a storm was rolling in. William K.D., the dairy farmer, would recount later. The cows began to bellow, and the air felt dense. Then, the light materialized, descending slowly into his southern pasture. It was a late summer evening outside Cherry Creek, a tranquil farming enclave in western New York. The fields still glistened from recent rainfall, and the horizon shimmered softly beneath the remnants of the setting sun. William and his son, just shy of 17, were gathering tools from the shed when the humming grew audible, steady like machinery dulled by distance. Initially, he suspected it might be a helicopter, with the nearest base situated in Buffalo, where military aircraft occasionally traversed the skies above the valley. Yet, the sound lacked the expected rhythmic pulse. Instead, it vibrated. The boy gestured towards the distant field, where a patch of air shimmered, as if heated. Within moments, a circular craft emerged through the haze, glowing a muted orange along its periphery. It halted roughly 20 feet above the earth, then descended with an eerie stillness, resting soundlessly upon the ground. The Keyhoe farm epitomized the quintessential agricultural operation, 40 acres of meticulously tended land encompassing 2 barns and a time-worn house, encircled by verdant cornfields and grazing pastures. This was not the type of family inclined to partake in tales of the extraordinary. Yet, that very morning, the ordinary transformed into the reason for NICAP's newfound attentiveness. As William recounted, the moment the craft had touched down, the herd of cows stampeding to escape, the resonant humming ceased. The light surrounding the craft dimmed into a gentle ruby hue, while a delicate fog unfurled around the object. He and his son stood motionless, confined to the edge of the fence, uncertain about approaching any closer. The craft bore no wings, no rotors, nor any insignia, just a seamless metallic facade mirroring the landscape like a piece of curved glass. He estimated its dimensions to be approximately 30 feet in diameter and 8 feet in height, topped with a gently arched dome. They lingered for nearly a minute before the humming returned, sharper this time, escalating into a vibration that coursed through their boots. The craft rose steadily upward, hovered momentarily, then shot into the sky. The wind generated in its wake transformed the grass into a swirling pattern, and the air became saturated with the pungent scent of ozone. With the arrival of daylight, the family revisited the site. The outline was still visible, a circular area of flattened grass roughly 40 feet across. The earth beneath revealed a darkened, parched surface, while the vegetation along the border displayed wilting stems as if exposed to an intense heat for just a fleeting moment. William's compass, when brought near the circle's edge, spun chaotically. He reported the puzzling incident to the local sheriff's office, prompting deputies to arrive for inspection. They took photographs and cordoned off the region. Within 2 days, John Leup, an investigator for NICAP, arrived from Rochester equipped with a camera, sample jars, and a portable Geiger counter. A meticulous examination of the site ensued, documenting readings that indicated a slight yet measurable increase in radiation, non-threatening yet elevated compared to the usual background levels. Soil samples procured from the ring revealed traces of calcium and potassium, fused into a delicate crust as if subjected to an extreme heat burst exceeding 1 second. No evidence of burning or chemical residue was detected. The inquiry swiftly attracted significant attention, with reporters traveling from both Jamestown and Buffalo, followed by intrigued locals who congregated at the fence line, peering at the mysterious circular scar carved into the pasture. The Keyhoe family chose to evade interviews, with William reiterating only what he had previously conveyed to police. He witnessed a luminous round craft descend, hover, and ascend vertically. His son corroborated every detail. The Air Force's Project Blue Book office subsequently reached out to the sheriff, dispatching 2 representatives to investigate the scene. The officers collected duplicate soil samples and documented their findings with photographs. Their ensuing statement postulated that the markings might have resulted from natural ground heating or lightning activity, even though weather reports indicated no storms within 100 meters of the location that night. Leup's report for NICAP, however, drew a contrasting conclusion. The site exhibited characteristics of transient high-energy contact, with physical evidence inconsistent with recognized atmospheric or electrical phenomena. In interviews conducted later that month, the accounts of witnesses remained unwavering. The boy depicted the light as solid rather than glaring and noted that the underside of the object appeared smooth and reflective, akin to melted steel. He conveyed one detail that remained imprinted on investigators' minds. Upon the object's ascent, the family's kitchen radio fell silent before erupting into static for nearly a minute. The event unfolded within a brief span of fewer than 5 minutes, yet for the residents of Cherry Creek, it left an indelible mark that transcended the mere physical evidence. William Keyhoe had dedicated his life to this farm. Born in 1922, he served in the Army Corps of Engineers during the war, returned to New York afterward, and married a local educator. Renowned in the county for his methodical record-keeping of crops and livestock, he harbored no interest in science fiction or government conspiracies. Post-encounter, he slipped back into the rhythm of daily life. He milked cows, mended fences, and awaited the return of growth in the field. By autumn, the soil had begun to restore, Yet the circular formation in the grass persisted, subtly discernible the following spring, a patch of deeper green that stubbornly refused to blend with the remainder of the pasture. When NICAP followed up a year later, William professed he no longer sought to fathom the phenomenon. Whatever it was, he stated it seemed disinclined to linger. Over time, the official explanations evolved. Some posited that the light was perhaps plasma resulting from a lightning discharge. Others speculated a small aircraft in distress. Yet, the geometric precision of the landing ring defied such theories. The indentation was flawlessly symmetrical, crafted with 4 shallow depressions evenly distributed along its circumference, as though it had settled upon landing gear. This pattern resurfaced in at least 3 subsequent cases, prompting NICAP to extend its investigations throughout the Northeast. Each case bore similarities in size, radiation readings, and scorched vegetation. For NICAP analysts, Cherry Creek emerged as an early case study for what they classified as a close encounter of the second kind, evidence on the ground. The case distinguished itself not due to theatrical moments, but because the witnesses portrayed stability, the site was quantifiable, and meticulous documentation accompanied it. Layup's report cataloged 20 photographs, spectral analysis of soil mineral content, along with testimonies from 2 county officials. The report culminated with a solitary line, typed in uppercase letters. Evidence indicates contact with an unknown vehicle. Years later, when reflecting on whether he regretted reporting the sighting, William replied in the negative. He expressed to a local newspaper a preference for being thought mistaken over staying silent regarding what he had witnessed. It was not figment, he asserted. It was merely something beyond names. Eventually, the circular patch buried beneath new growth vanished, yet photographs preserved its shape, an immaculate ring framed by 4 darker impressions where the grass had been compressed into the ground. Leither forwarded copies of those photographs to NICAP headquarters in Washington, where they reside in archives categorized under physical ground traces. Project Blue Book concluded its investigation into the Cherry Creek case in the latter months of 1966, summarizing the findings with the term hoax or misinterpretation possible, citing an absence of conclusive evidence. However, behind closed doors, Air Force correspondents acknowledged that the soil analysis indicated heat exposure that contradicted conventional hoaxing techniques. This particular letter remained undisclosed to the media affiliated with NICAP. In the years that followed, the case continued to circulate within research circles, appearing in the 1969 Compendium of Unexplained Landings. It was noted as one of the few instances in which measurable radiation accompanied a credible witness account. When Layup concluded his investigative work, he described Cherry Creek as the cleanest field trace he had ever measured. His field notes concluded with a reflection that had an almost poetic quality, suggesting that the phenomenon landed where it desired, left a mark, and then retreated without a sound. Whatever intelligence governed the event seemed to favor silent departures. Nowadays, little of the original site remains. The Keyhoe farm, sold after William's passing in the 1980s, has long since been plowed under. Nevertheless, the photographs, witness statements, and soil analyses endure as testimonies of a solitary evening when a circle of scorched grass outlined a division between the known and the unexplained. For NICAP, Cherry Creek epitomized the core values embraced by its founders, not the spectacle of belief, but meticulous documentation. It embodied the humility of witnesses who weren't striving to prove anything. Rather, they sought to preserve the truth of their experiences. Ultimately, the narrative of that night transcends the notions of visitation or mystery. It centers on a farmer and his son standing in tranquil observation beneath the expanse of the sky, witnessing a descent, a hovering presence, and a quiet departure, alongside the faint impression it left upon the ground, an imprint that science could measure but never fully elucidate. The period from 1962 to 1963 at the Ridgerest Wave in California bore witness to phenomena taking place above the China Lake Naval Weapons Center, a locale primarily reserved for test flights and classified ordnance. During this time, Something wholly distinct began to manifest. The reports originated not from civilians or newspaper enthusiasts, but from engineers, radar operators, and range officers, individuals trained to assess velocity and trajectory rather than indulge in flights of fancy. Between the autumn of 1962 and the spring of 1963, a series of aerial intrusions emerged at the base, marked by their uniqueness and ultimately dubbed informally as the Ridge Arrest Wave. My own initial observation occurred over the Coso Range, where one radar technician later recounted how an object remained motionless before accelerating smoothly. Initially, I had thought it a test aircraft originating from Edwards, but then it executed a sudden 90-degree reversal. This statement, documented in December 1962, stands among the first of many recorded. The object had been tracked at approximately 15,000 feet, holding its position for nearly a minute before it ascended vertically beyond radar reach. 2 additional personnel in the control room noted the same trace on the screen, a sharp, solid return absent of transponder code or IFFF signal. Despite the subsequent barrage of official explanations, citing temperature inversions, radar echoes, and atmospheric reflections, an unvoiced question lingered. How could a false return perform coordinated maneuvers? In the subsequent months, reports of sightings intensified. Security staff on night patrol described luminous disks gliding across restricted test ranges, executing sharp turns and pausing in midair. A maintenance crew north of Ridge Arrest observed a glowing object hovering above the dry lake bed for several moments, only to extinguish its light altogether, leaving an empty sky in its wake. The accounts were meticulously documented, often ensconced in technical jargon. None of the witnesses employed the term craft. Instead, they referred to lights, shapes, movements, and data, yet remained without definitive conclusions. One particular memorandum from the Naval Ordnance Test Station conveyed that personnel had witnessed unidentified aerial objects performing maneuvers inconsistent with known aircraft, noting that the objects emitted steady, non-pulsing light. Attempts to establish radio communication proved fruitless. This memorandum never reached the public eye. It circulated internally and was eventually forwarded to NICAP by a civilian radar engineer who had worked under contract at the range. At that point, the base was deeply engaged in guided missile testing, and the skies thrummed with trails, boosters, and the fleeting signatures of experimental designs. Encountering something outside the norm was far from unusual. What was extraordinary, however, was witnessing something executing a flight path independently of the established schedule. Radar logs from early 1963 document multiple unidentified returns tracked concurrently, occasionally 3 or 4 at one time, each navigating through the restricted range. The echoes recorded appeared solid, rather than diffuse like weather clutter. These same logs illustrate abrupt accelerations, with objects traversing dozens of miles in mere seconds and occasionally vanishing entirely between radar sweeps. One controller, reflecting on the data years later, characterized it succinctly. We were unveiling something performing profiles that did not align with anything we were familiar with. Among the most comprehensive visual accounts emerged from Lieutenant Commander Frank Dillon, a test pilot stationed at China Lake during that era. In a letter drafted years later, he chronicled a night training flight when a brilliant white disk manifested above the Sierra ridgeline, keeping pace with his aircraft for nearly 20 seconds before executing a vertical ascent. He promptly reported the sighting, noting that base radar confirmed an echo on his vector, yet lost it upon reaching 40,000 feet. No craft from their side could match that elevation or course. He was instructed to categorize it as a weather phenomenon. Dillon's letter, received by NICAP in 1965 through unofficial means, joined a multitude of statements quietly collected from service personnel disinterested in public attention. Each account was isolated yet strikingly consistent, featuring silent lights, abrupt climbs, precise right-angle turns, no sonic booms, and no thermal signatures detectable via infrared. These testimonies began to weigh heavily on the base command. By April 1963, an internal investigation was launched to ascertain whether these lights might signify unauthorized incursions, potentially involving foreign reconnaissance. A liaison officer from the Air Defense Command was dispatched to facilitate the flow of information. For a span of 2 weeks, radar and optical devices were meticulously aligned for nighttime scrutiny. The records from those evenings are sparse, yet reveal much. On 3 distinct occasions, unidentified objects manifested within constrained airspace, concurrently tracked by ground radar and visual observers. They displayed instantaneous acceleration, abrupt halts, and swift directional shifts. One entry inscribed in pencil at the bottom of the page simply mentions, "Target divided in 2." No corresponding aircraft could be identified. After the second week, the Air Force liaison withdrew, categorizing the phenomena as unverified aerial reflections. The file was subsequently closed for NICAP. Nevertheless, the ridge arrest material indicated something unprecedented. This was not merely an isolated event, rather it denoted a pattern. Analysts within the organization compiled the disparate testimonies into a comprehensive report titled Ridge Arrest Range Anomalous Activity, covering the years 1962 to 1963. The report underscored the integrity of the witnesses, including military officers, radar operators, and engineers. The objects had been observed under controlled conditions, frequently by multiple observers employing calibrated instruments. It concluded with an assertion rarely encountered in NICAP literature, noting behaviors that suggested a discernible intelligence behind the control. No recognized natural or technological process could adequately explain the reported accelerations. This document circulated privately among scientific advisors, including several at the Stanford Research Institute, but it never saw public dissemination. By 1964, much of the radar data from the Navy's operations at China Lake had been classified. The sightings gradually slipped from public discourse. In subsequent interviews, various technicians who had been part of that period recounted these encounters not as enigmas, but as unforeseen interruptions. They were uninvited presences intruding into a realm fundamentally grounded in precision. Retired Chief Howard Rice recounted how he observed the radar sweep capturing a return directly above a live test area just moments before an aborted missile launch. "It wasn't meant to be there," he remarked with a sense of disbelief. "We did not know what it was, but command chose to halt the test." Another individual, an electronics specialist named Arthur Gray, recalled an even more peculiar occurrence. 3 separate scopes located in different buildings all registered identical returns at the exact moment, a pattern that would have been inconceivable for a single localized reflection. Years later, he chuckled when reflecting on the situation. "We were compensated to measure phenomena, not to believe in them," he noted. Yet those were not specters on the screen. When the ridge arrest material eventually made its way to NICAP's Washington office, it was internally classified under Military Installations, Multi-Observer Instrumental. Analysts considered it one of the most compelling sets of technical data they had ever assembled. However, the organization grappled with funding challenges and a tarnished public image. The scientific advisory panel insisted on a need for correlation with civilian data, including photographs, magnetic readings, and atmospheric logs, yet none of these existed. Consequently, the ridge arrest file was relegated to long-term storage, labeled as pending verification. It was never revisited. The public stance of the United States Navy on the issue remained steadfast: no evidence of unidentified craft, no security threat. In private, though, engineers at China Lake found themselves continuing discussions about the ridge arrest lights well into the late 1960s. A few maintained copies of the original radar charts. One, dated February 1963, notably illustrated 3 simultaneous echoes forming a perfect triangle over the weapons range, each maintaining its position for nearly a minute before accelerating outward in disparate directions. It was data bereft of interpretation, a geometry that defied logical understanding. By the time NICAP disbanded in the 1970s, much of the ridge arrest documentation had vanished, leaving only fragments in its wake. typed witness statements, photocopied radar prints, and a lone unsigned letter believed to originate from a Navy physicist involved in the initial inquiry. This letter articulates, in part, objects tracked above range demonstrated non-ballistic motion. Their behavior is consistent with controlled flight, source unknown. The correspondence recommends ongoing observation under radar optical correlation. The tone is clinical, imbued with a sense of weariness. As with most governmental correspondence from that epoch, it concludes not with conjecture, but with silence. What remains of the Ridge-arrest phenomenon today embodies less of a narrative and more a mathematical equation, angles, altitudes, and timings that stubbornly refuse to converge. The witnesses have long since retired, and the instruments have been updated, rendered obsolete by the advent of digital systems that rely on different recording methods. Yet the geometry persists: right angles in the sky, acceleration without inertia, echoes that multiply and dissipate. For later historians of the phenomenon, ridge arrest signifies the moment when the enigma shifted within the military apparatus, viewed not by believers, but rather by technicians. It was data birthed in secrecy and lost to the constraints of classification, a ripple of anomalies across a desert that has engulfed far stranger occurrences. One of the few surviving analysts from NICAP's Western office succinctly encapsulated the essence in a note discovered in the margins of the archived report: no event, no incident, only pattern. This succinctly defined what the ridge arrest wave ultimately became: not a singular sighting, but a quiet rhythm resonating through the instruments of a weapons range, a succession of lights executing impossible maneuvers above a landscape meticulously designed for control. For those who witnessed these phenomena, there was never an answer, only a persistent question inscribed across the radar displays of the early space age. Who else was experimenting above the desert sky? Perhaps your eyelids are heavy, but if you remain engaged, continue with us. Following are a few understated tales, each constituting a concealed encounter worthy of remembrance. The Kecksburg, Pennsylvania incident, 1965. On the evening of December 9, 1965, the serene farming community of Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, was jolted by an event that has subsequently become one of the most renowned UFO cases in the annals of American history. Often referred to as the Roswell of the East, the incident commenced with a blazing object traversing the skies over the northeastern United States and Canada, observed by thousands of people. To many, it appeared as though a meteor was disintegrating while entering the atmosphere. Yet, for the close-knit community of Kecksburg, the narrative reached far beyond the celestial realm. According to residents, something made contact with the earth in the nearby woods. What followed was an unsettling emergence of military personnel, shadowy agents, and figures that evoked the notorious image of the Men in Black. Around 4:45 in the evening, witnesses spanning 6 states reported witnessing a magnificent fireball soaring southwest. Newspapers in cities such as Detroit, Windsor, and Pittsburgh were inundated with frantic calls from the public. Eyewitness accounts described a fiery entity trailing sparks, at times moving with an unusual grace, almost as if it were maneuvered with intent. NASA would later assert that it was merely a meteor, but many observers contested that the object's trajectory seemed too deliberate to be a mere natural phenomenon. In Kecksburg, located southeast of Pittsburgh, multiple locals recounted witnessing the object descend into a wooded ravine. A young boy playing outdoors saw it pass overhead before disappearing behind a cluster of trees. Adult residents in the vicinity reported hearing a thud, reminiscent of something striking the earth, although no explosion ensued. Almost immediately, curious townsfolk ventured into the woods to uncover the mystery. What they discovered became central to the enigma. Eyewitnesses described a large acorn-shaped object half buried in the ground. About the size of a compact car, it showcased a bronze hue adorned with peculiar markings or inscriptions at its base, similar to hieroglyphs. The object appeared to be intact rather than shattered like a typical meteorite. Some who approached reported that it emanated a faint humming sound or vibration. However, before locals could conduct a thorough investigation, the area was inundated with armed personnel. Military vehicles rumbled into Kecksburg within hours, barricading access and cordoning off the forested areas. Individuals in uniforms moved purposefully through the vicinity, instructing civilians to evacuate. Residents recounted seeing armed soldiers stationed along dirt paths, maintaining a perimeter. The expediency of the military's response astonished many. They found it implausible that a random meteorite crash would attract such rapid attention in a rural town. Accompanying the soldiers, locals reported encountering additional figures, men in plain suits whose manner was both stern and authoritative. According to witnesses, these men seemed to orchestrate the proceedings just as much as the uniformed officers did. They refrained from introducing themselves or displaying any form of identification. Instead, they interrogated locals who had observed the object, pressing them for details. Numerous witnesses later recounted being explicitly instructed to remain silent. One farmer, who had observed the object from close range, told a reporter years later of his encounter with two men in dark suits near the barricaded area. They inquired meticulously about what he had seen, and upon hearing his description of the acorn-shaped craft, they exchanged a knowing glance before issuing a stern warning. "You did not see that. You will not discuss this again." Their tone, though calm, bore the weight of a directive. The farmer admitted that he was so shaken by the experience that he chose to remain silent about the sighting for decades. Another local woman, residing near the ravine, informed investigators that she had witnessed a convoy of trucks exiting the woods late that night, transporting something concealed beneath tarps. She recounted being halted on the road by men who commanded her to turn back immediately. When she later attempted to recount her experience, men in suits visited her home, insisting she must have been mistaken. They left her visibly rattled and hesitant to pursue her story any further. The combination of the swift military response and the intimidating presence of the suited figures became emblematic of the Kecksburg case. For many, it represented the classic Men in Black narrative, wherein a UFO crash is swiftly followed by unidentified officials suppressing potential witnesses. Unlike the more surreal encounters experienced by Albert Bender, the figures in Kecksburg seamlessly integrated with the military presence, complicating any attempt to delineate between the two. Nonetheless, locals maintained that the suited individuals possessed a distinct aura, more bureaucratic and commanding, feeling fundamentally out of place in a rural Pennsylvania community. As night descended, the woods were entirely sealed off. Reporters from local radio stations attempted to approach the site but were rebuffed. One journalist from WHJB Radio, John Murphy, managed to gather interviews from witnesses describing the object, but his colleagues later noted that Murphy's material had been confiscated. Some suggest he was visited by government officials who pressured him to relinquish tapes and photographs. His subsequent reporting on the incident was curiously subdued, and he later met an untimely end in a suspicious car accident, raising further speculation that he had been silenced. By the following day, the woods had become a void. Whatever had fallen in Kecksburg had vanished without a trace. Official narratives asserted that nothing had been recovered and that the fireball was merely a meteor burning up in the atmosphere. Yet the townsfolk remained unconvinced. Too many people had witnessed too much. The object in the woods, the plethora of military vehicles, the enigmatic figures enforcing silence, these elements combined to create a lasting impression. For years, Kecksburg remained a topic of hushed conversations and local legends. Witnesses were hesitant to step forward, fearing mockery or intimidation. However, in the 1990s, a resurgence of interest surrounding the case encouraged several of them to share their stories publicly, detailing encounters with figures reminiscent of the Men in Black. They characterized these figures as pale, expressionless, and utterly commanding. Unlike the soldiers who followed orders, these men appeared to issue them, raising the question of what truly fell in Kecksburg. Some researchers speculate it may have been a Soviet satellite, quite possibly part of the Cosmos series, discreetly retrieved by the U.S. military. Others point to the craft's unique acorn shape and markings as potential evidence of extraterrestrial origin. NASA has consistently maintained that no object was ever recovered. However, in 2003, they revealed that documentation regarding the incident had mysteriously disappeared, a statement that only intensified public intrigue. What remains unmistakable is the palpable intimidation experienced by those who witnessed the events unfold. The arrival of men clad in dark suits who effectively dissuaded individuals from sharing their accounts aligns with a recurring theme observed in numerous UFO occurrences. Their apparent role in Kecksburg seems to have been to mold the narrative, ensuring that the remarkable stayed concealed beneath a facade of meteors and natural phenomena. For the residents of that quaint Pennsylvania town, the memory of that fateful night endures, echoing through the decades. Those who were children then recall the sudden surge of military vehicles and the unsettling silence that enveloped their community in the aftermath. Whispers persist about the enigmatic object nestled within the woods, the peculiar symbols engraved upon its surface, and the figures made certain they would keep quiet about it. The Kecksburg incident is frequently celebrated not merely for the craft itself, that acorn-shaped entity that momentarily rested in a Pennsylvania forest, but equally for the men who followed. These figures in suits transformed a spectacular sighting into an obscured recollection. Whether they were agents of the government, operatives of intelligence, or representatives of something even more extraordinary, their impact mirrored that experienced in Bender's era and during Hopkins's encounter in Maine. The erasure of truth was expertly upheld by individuals who appeared to be predetermined to safeguard secrets. To many researchers, Kecksburg epitomizes the most compelling instance of men in black interference on American soil. Not merely a fleeting visit aimed at silencing a solitary witness, this was a well-coordinated effort intertwining soldiers with suited individuals, effectively silencing a town that had glimpsed something it ought not to have witnessed. Consider the episode at the White Sands Range in New Mexico during 1957. Witness the response from the technicians as one murmured that it was not an ordinary aircraft. The radar room at White Sands was constructed for meticulous accuracy. On an average night, the air buzzed with low static and the steady rhythm of instruments measuring distance, velocity, and time. Yet this particular night in 1957 was anything but standard. The glowing trace on the screen was consistent, sharply defined, and moving faster than anything ever registered by the range. Chief Warrant Officer Ben Davis, assuming the role of shift supervisor, stood resolutely behind the console, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. At the age of 41, he possessed the wisdom of both war and science. A radar specialist with a background in the U.S. Army Signal Corps in Europe, Davis had transitioned into the Air Force's Missile Tracking Division. Those who worked alongside him noted that he could decipher an echo's meaning simply by observing the curve of its shape. He had dedicated half his life staring into phosphor screens, translating what others deemed mere noise. On that fateful night, what he witnessed bore no resemblance to noise whatsoever. He instructed his operator to maintain that gain steady. The return continued to be crisp. It had entered the range from the north, ascended, and then abruptly halted in the center of the display. Davis frowned, observing. "That is solid," he muttered. "That is real metal." The atmosphere at White Sands in 1957 was one of control. Every aircraft was cataloged, every missile documented, every radar calibration recorded to the precise second. There was nothing ad-libbed about the environment. This precise nature rendered the subsequent minutes all the more perplexing. At a secondary radar station 30 meters away, the same target manifested at the identical coordinates. 2 different systems, 2 different antennas, 1 object. Both instruments agreed, marking it as a strong, rapid contact operating under deliberate control. Davis took up the phone and contacted range control, stating they had an unknown high-altitude maneuvering object that was not one of theirs. The reply was clipped yet cautious, advising continued observation. For nearly a minute, the technicians watched as the blip remained static at an altitude of around 60,000 feet. Then, unexpectedly, it veered sharply eastward and accelerated beyond the limits of the scope's maximum range. The trace elongated, became blurred, and vanished into nothingness. Silence cascaded around the room, interrupted only by the slow hum of cooling fans. When they replayed the radar footage, the movement became unmistakably clear. A clean trajectory crossing the grid, stopping, executing an instantaneous 90-degree turn, and disappearing at speeds that the recording apparatus simply could not quantify. One of the operators suggested it must have been some form of echo or a glitch. Davis shook his head in disbelief. "You don't receive an echo that halts abruptly," he remarked quietly, "and you definitely do not receive one that performs a turn." He ordered that the film be labeled and secured for further review. Within a mere 24 hours, 2 men from Air Force Intelligence arrived at the range. Dressed in civilian suits and carrying unmarked cases, their inquiries were brief, their demeanor cordial, their intentions unmistakable. They collected the film, the calibration charts, and even the handwritten logs. No one raised any objections. They assured the workers it was merely an evaluation, as one of the younger technicians later recounted. Yet when they departed, an unspoken understanding settled among the group. They would never see that film again. A few weeks later, an official memorandum arrived from Air Defense Command, categorizing the event as a radar anomaly, probably caused by a meteor reflection or atmospheric disturbance. The explanation felt stale, as though extracted from a worn protocol. For Davis, it felt like an affront. Throughout his career, he had recognized radar phantoms, and this was undeniably not one of them. "Meteors do not hover," he asserted to his team. "Reflections do not make right angles." Life resumed its usual pattern at the range. Rockets ascended and descended, while telemetry data amassed in filing cabinets, with no one daring to mention the incident except in hushed private conversations. However, those technicians present that evening did not allow it to fade from their minds. A few months later, during yet another missile test, 2 radar operators reported a similar unknown object pacing alongside a launch. A faint luminous figure was visually observed that night, moving parallel to the rocket's trajectory before suddenly shooting upward. Range control dismissed it as mere coincidence. Davis remained unconvinced. "We have already captured something genuine once," he insisted. "It is still out there." By the time NICAP received word of the incident from 1957, many years had elapsed. Much of the original documentation had gone missing, yet 3 technicians, Davis included, provided sworn affidavits to the organization. Each statement recounted a similar sequence of events: a solid radar return, sudden directional shifts, a sustained hover, and a vanishing act at speeds that defied known technology. Investigators from NICAP meticulously cross-referenced launch schedules and verified that no tests were underway at that time. The night sky was clear, and the radar systems were fully operational. The conclusion was straightforward. The object had indeed existed, a tangible entity external to any military operations. For the analysts stationed in Washington, this case presented a rare convergence of elements: trained observers, corroborating radar stations, and a suppression of primary evidence by authorities. Thus, it found its place in the 1964 UFO evidence report under the section for radar visual correlation from White Sands Missile Range, 1957. Though brief, the entry was significant, underscoring that the most critical data points were often those that the government chose to overlook. Ben Davis chose to retire from active service 2 years later, relocating to Colorado with his wife and 2 sons. He seldom discussed his experiences at White Sands, but in a correspondence with a former colleague, he reflected on the night when the radar detected something the world was not ready to comprehend. His letter concluded with a haunting line: "I do not know what it was, but it knew who we were." The men who had worked alongside him recalled him as precise but equitable, a technician who sought proof rather than mere belief. If he claimed it was real, one of them later recounted to NICAP researchers, then it unquestionably was real. When Air Force records for 1957 were later scrutinized during the declassification process, the subsection detailing that fateful range night was inexplicably absent. The radar film had been deemed misfiled, and the calibration documents destroyed while in storage. No trace of the data endured, yet the witnesses persisted, their memories unwavering even decades afterward. One of them vividly described how he could still envision the trace in his mind, recalling the bright sweep across the dark grid, the astonishing halt, the vertical ascent to the east. It was flawless, he maintained, too flawless to be mere noise. It felt as though something out there was revealing its capabilities. For NYAP, the incident at White Sands Range emerged as quiet testament that the phenomenon was not merely a visual apparition. It was quantifiable, captured, and replicable under regulated conditions. It constituted a technical enigma in its purest form, observed by seasoned experts, documented by instruments, and ultimately buried in procedural obscurity. Ultimately, all that remains from that night is the memory of a small cadre of men, radar operators stationed in the desert, observing their devices relay a truth that no one wished to confront. Somewhere above the vast, desolate stretches of New Mexico, a solitary blip traversed the scope with intent, paused, and then vanished, leaving behind nothing but silence, speculations, and the recollection of Chief Warrant Officer Ben Davis, who had seen sufficient to affirm it was no error. The Falcon Lake incident unfurled on the 20th of May, 1967, in the wilderness of Manitoba, Canada, where a prospector named Stefan Michalak embarked on what he presumed would be an ordinary day of searching for minerals. An accomplished outdoorsman known for his meticulous habits, he was a practical individual within his community. Yet what he encountered that day near Falcon Lake would evolve into one of the most confounding and well-documented UFO cases in Canadian annals. Unlike numerous other sightings that hinge solely on witness accounts, this episode left behind concrete evidence, burns, traces of radioactivity, and a perplexing riddle that is yet to be unraveled. Michalak had been investigating a location near Falcon Lake, recognized for its dense woodlands and rugged outcrops. Armed with his tools and provisions, he anticipated a long but uneventful day of prospecting. However, around noon, he was taken aback by the sudden descent of two luminous objects through the sky. Initially, he suspected they might be experimental airplanes or perhaps helicopters. However, their maneuvers were unlike anything he had previously encountered. One of the objects hovered momentarily before soaring away, while the other settled on a nearby flat rock surface. Curiosity overriding trepidation, he approached, thinking it could be a military vehicle in need of aid. As he neared, he discerned that the object possessed a disc-like shape, metallic and polished with a dome-like apex. Its surface shimmered under the sunlight, and the atmosphere surrounding it felt electrically charged. He later recounted that it measured approximately 35 feet in diameter, exhibiting a seamless, radiant exterior. Overwhelmed by curiosity, Michalak ventured close enough to make contact with the craft. He placed his gloved hand against its surface but recoiled immediately, for the metal was searing hot. Through what appeared to be a small opening or hatch, he caught a glimpse of an intense light and heard muffled voices, though the words were indistinguishable. Attempting to establish communication, he called out in English, followed by Polish and then German, but received no response. In mere moments, the hatch closed with a mechanical thud. As he continued inspecting the craft, a grid-like panel unexpectedly opened on the side. Without warning, a scorching surge of air and gas erupted from the vent. The force propelled him backward, igniting his shirt in flames. In a frantic effort to extinguish the fire, he realized that his chest and abdomen had endured burns, marked in a distinctive pattern, dozens of small squares arranged in a grid-like formation. The pain was excruciating, leaving him dizzy and nauseated, trapped in a haze of disorientation. The object ascended silently into the skies and then vanquished at astonishing speed, leaving Michalak alone in the rocky clearing. Shocked and injured, he struggled to navigate his way back to civilization. The journey proved arduous. He found himself vomiting frequently and overwhelmed by waves of weakness. By the time he finally reached a nearby road, several hours had passed. He somehow made it back home, only for his condition to deteriorate further. His skin blistered, his eyes burned with intensity, and he suffered from persistent headaches and notable weight loss in the ensuing weeks. Medical evaluations confirmed that he had indeed sustained radiation-like burns. Repeated photographic documentation captured the grid-like pattern etched into his torso as it emerged, faded, and then reappeared over time. His health complications became an official matter of record, leaving physicians divided regarding the underlying cause. Some posited the possibility of chemical burns, yet the distinctiveness of the pattern alongside the other symptoms did not align with such an explanation. In the wake of the incident, investigators swiftly descended upon the site. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and civilian UFO enthusiasts all expressed keen interest. The section of Earth where the object had alighted exhibited peculiar evidence. Moss and vegetation were scorched in a precise circular formation. Radiation assessments indicated heightened levels of radioactive isotopes, most notably radium-226, both in the soil and on the samples of Michalak's clothing. For years, the singed foliage within that circle failed to regenerate. Skeptics sought alternative explanations. Some contended that Moloch had contrived the burns himself, yet the question remained unanswered as to why a prospector leading a stable family life would endure such pain solely for the sake of attention. Others proposed that he may have been subjected to industrial chemicals, though, again, no such chemicals were discovered at the scene, and the injuries manifested a strange grid pattern that deviated from the irregular damage typical of an accident. The Air Force scrutinized the evidence with considerable diligence. Their conclusion was not to dismiss the event as a fabrication, but to categorize the case as unresolved. For decades, the Canadian government maintained documentation concerning the incident, many of which eventually surfaced years later due to Freedom of Information requests. These files detailed not only the tangible evidence, but also underscored the seriousness with which authorities approached the matter. For Michalak, the event afforded little solace. He grappled with ongoing health issues, including recurrent rashes and digestive troubles, all while navigating unwanted media scrutiny. Despite these challenges, he unwaveringly upheld his narrative. Over the years, he recounted the incident with consistency, eschewing embellishment and refraining from claiming more than what he had witnessed and endured. He firmly asserted that he confronted something real without ever suggesting it was of extraterrestrial origin. His demeanor remained unadorned and candid. He had observed a craft, sustained injuries from it, and continued to live with the repercussions. The Falcon Lake incident is frequently heralded as Canada's most renowned UFO case, and rightly so. It featured a highly credible witness devoid of any history of deceit, left behind tangible evidence, and drew extensive inquiries from both civilian and military entities. Unlike many sightings that remain fleeting, this case is anchored in concrete remnants, burns on the witness's skin, radioactive soil, and withered vegetation that stubbornly resisted regeneration. Even today, a satisfactory explanation continues to elude investigators. If it were a military test craft, no documentation has emerged to bolster that theory. If it was a ruse, it was one that left a man with enduring scars and a reputation he never sought. And if it truly represented something beyond human technological capacity, it remains one of the clearest illustrations of how closely such enigmas can weave into the lives of ordinary individuals. In tranquil Falcon Lake, now a haven for fishing, hiking, and wilderness retreats, a hushed narrative endures. For those who delve into the unexplained, it stands as sacred ground, the site where a prospector stumbled into an encounter that irrevocably altered his existence. The tale persists, not because it delivers answers, but rather because it defies them. A man seeking minerals in the Canadian wild instead confronted a searing reality, the nature of which transcends explanation, leaving behind undeniable evidence in a puzzle that continues to resonate within the woods of Manitoba. As the inquiry transitions to the Essex Field entity in 1979, the scene is set in Essex, England. What was anticipated to be an ordinary summer weekend took an unexpected turn on the evening of August 17, 1979. Three teenagers from Colchester, Stephen Marsh, 15, his cousin Daniel Marsh, 16, and their friend Aaliyah Forum, also 15, embarked on a weekend hiking excursion. Their destination was a stretch of pastoral land near the quaint village of Tish Hunt Major. The region drew locals for its camping allure, nestled amidst abandoned pillboxes and hedgerows that had remained unchanged since the Second World War. The trio intended to camp for the night in the fields just beyond an old irrigation ditch, a locale recommended by Stephen's older brother for its seclusion and its excellent vantage point for gazing at the night sky. Aaliyah had brought along a small camera, while Daniel toted a portable radio. Stephen, the ever-prepared scout, packed a flashlight, 2 compasses, and a well-worn edition of the Observer's Book of Astronomy. They set up their compact tent at around 7:30 in the evening, cooked sausages over a small gas stove before settling down for what they expected to be an uneventful night. However, around 9:40, as twilight surrendered to darkness, Aaliyah noticed a glow at the field's edge. She asked if they could see that, prompting all 3 to turn their attention to a soft amber light shimmering above the barley, perhaps 200 meters away. Initially, it seemed still. Then, it pulsed gently yet rhythmically. Daniel speculated it might be a car's headlights or a lantern, but the glow moved in a disorienting manner, hovering and shifting sideways, not swaying as light would through tree branches or reflecting from a moving vehicle. There was no road in that direction, just open fields. They gathered their equipment and cautiously advanced toward it, walking silently along the dirt path that lined the crops. The night was still, broken only by the sounds of insects and the occasional bark of a distant dog. As they neared within 30 meters of the light, Stephen raised his flashlight and momentarily illuminated the source. What they beheld rendered them all motionless. Standing in the field was a figure resembling a humanoid, approximately 6 feet tall. It was clad in a dark, seemingly metallic suit, and its head was enveloped by a smooth, domed helmet that caught the light. In its right hand, the figure grasped a slender rod or wand, which emitted a series of sharp, pulsing beeps. The light emanating from the figure was traced back to a small device affixed to its chest or shoulder. The figure maneuvered deliberately through the barley, crouching to gather samples. They observed the entity utilizing the rod to scrutinize the plants before carefully selecting stalks and depositing them into a container slung over its shoulder. For what felt like an eternity, the teenagers remained concealed behind a low hedge, fixated on the scene unfolding before them. Stephen whispered that it was not human, not truly. Aaliyah questioned the purpose of its actions. Daniel held his radio to his ear, cycling through frequencies, but was met with static engulfing every channel, a thick silence disrupted only by a low hum. The figure appeared oblivious to their presence, entirely engrossed in its task. Suddenly, the light on its chest began to pulse with increased rapidity. It straightened up, advancing toward the heart of the field. A moment later, an astoundingly brilliant flash engulfed the area, accompanied by a pulsation that vibrated beneath their feet. With another pulse, the figure vanished without a sound, leaving only the quiet field to reclaim the night. In a state of shock, the teenagers fled. They reached the village within a short time and recounted their astonishing experience to the local police at the station. Constable Malcolm Rudd listened intently as they described the same figure, actions, and equipment. Prompted by their accounts, Rudd accompanied them back to the field shortly after midnight. At the location indicated by the youths, what he discovered was striking, a flattened circular patch in the barley measuring approximately 10 feet in diameter. The crop lay in a perfect spiral formation, unbroken and uniform. At its center, 3 smaller square sections of missing plants exhibited clean removal, with no traces of trampling or disrupted roots. Astonishingly, there were no footprints. Rudd took Polaroids of the scene and submitted an incident report, labeling the occurrence as unexplained activity in a rural zone. The event, however, never underwent a formal investigation. Before the flash, Aaliyah had managed to capture a single photo, revealing a vague silhouette partially shrouded by glare in the midst of the barley. This image was dismissed as inconclusive, yet she maintained possession of it alongside her meticulous sketches and notes. In the days that followed, Daniel noted that his radio was malfunctioning, with the antenna burned out. Similarly, Stephen's compass exhibited signs of magnetic disruption as its needle wavered unsteadily. even when held perfectly still. By September, local media began to highlight the occurrence. The Essex Gazette published a brief article titled, "Teenagers Claim to See Alien in Field," shortly followed by a brief television segment on Anglia TV. The tone adopted was playful, bordering on derisive, yet the case captivated the interest of Ruth Elms, a postgraduate researcher at the University of Kent. Ruth had been diligently cataloging British close encounter reports when she reached out to the three witnesses. After conducting separate interviews, she meticulously compared their recounting and obtained copies of their personal documentation. In her paper from 1982, Silent Harvest: Anomaly in Essex, Ruth observed various consistencies with other biological sampling incidents reported in France and rural Illinois during the same decade. In each case, witnesses recounted encounters with humanoid entities, engaged in the extraction of plant life, utilizing advanced tools, frequently cloaked in darkness and accompanied by electromagnetic disturbances. The Ministry of Defense reportedly took note of Ruth's paper, though she received no formal response. Later in that same year, two researchers from the British UFO Research Association visited the site. By that point, the field had been harvested, yet soil samples taken from the former location of the circle revealed traces of thermal exposure and subtle radiation levels that exceeded background norms. The results remained inconclusive. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, the Essex case emerged as a minor fixture in fringe literature, appearing in various books and late-night radio discussions, never managed to be conclusively proven or explained. Stephen became a civil engineer, while Daniel relocated abroad. Aaliyah dedicated her time to art and education. At a conference in 2004 in Swindon, Ruth Elms reintroduced her theory, suggesting that events akin to the Essex occurrence mirrored systematic, non-hostile collection activities by unknown intelligences. The entities involved displayed no apparent interest in humans, but rather in botanical specimens. "It's not us they're examining," she stated, "but what we cultivate." In 2006, a Freedom of Information request uncovered a redacted Ministry of Defense briefing note alluding to the 1979 Essex phenomenon. Labeled AGR 101, Rural Biogenic Activity, the file included grainy reproductions of the spiral formation and characterized the report as credible, yet uncorroborated. Aaliyah shared in a 2010 interview with 40 Times that she had never felt the need for belief from others, asserting, "I know what I saw, and we understood we were not meant to." Her testimony reverberated with something deeper, an unspoken acknowledgement that not every interaction concerns illuminated skies or hovering ships. Often, it relates to what grows from the earth below. Even now, no logical explanation has been universally accepted. The Essex field entity remains an unresolved mystery, a fleeting visitation, a sample gathered, and a light swallowed by the enveloping dark. Why gather botanical specimens under the veil of night? The Mar del Plata Military Pursuit, 1965. On the 2nd of October, 1965, radar alerts disrupted the tranquility of a peaceful evening. At 22:16 hours, Suboficial Primero Luis Romero found himself isolated in the dimly lit radar control chamber at Argentina's Mar del Plata Naval Air Base. The room hummed softly, illuminated by the harsh glow of fluorescent strips as the gently sweeping radar arms scanned the skies. His fingers hovered over the console, documenting minor coastal aircraft movements when a sharp, unnatural ping illuminated the center of his screen. It was no mere blip. It was something extraordinary. Too fast, it sliced through the coastline at a breathtaking velocity exceeding 5,000 kilometers per hour. He leaned forward, fine-tuning the scope, and suddenly froze. The object did not follow a predictable arc or curve. It made a straight line, then abruptly halted mid-sweep. There was no deceleration, no hint of inertia. It simply stopped. Then, in an instant, it leapt laterally across a distance of 30 kilometers. Romero hesitated and tapped the console, suspecting a glitch, but the signal remained steadfast. The signature was authentic. He double-checked the sweep timing and felt a chill. Nothing added up. After years of observing military aircraft and weather balloons, Romero recognized that the behavior unfolding before his eyes surpassed any known flight characteristics. Grasping the red receiver, he transmitted the alert. Within 7 minutes, the base sirens shrieked. The sound of boots pounding against the concrete echoed as two IAE-33 Polki II jet fighters soared into action under high alert. Their mission: to intercept an unidentified, non-transponding object executing impossible maneuvers over sovereign airspace. They refrained from mentioning UFOs. It was unnecessary. Everyone who had examined the radar data understood this was not merely a civilian aircraft. In fact, it resembled no kind of aircraft at all. It was something altogether different. The Polki II, Argentina's crowning achievement in jet engineering, may not have been the fastest interceptor globally, but it was dependable and swift enough to tackle most regional threats. That evening, its two assigned pilots, Capitan Nesto Oliva and Teniente Eduardo Roachcha, were counted among the most reliable aviators on the base. As they sped down the runway, they remained oblivious to what lay ahead, fully aware only that the directive originated from the highest ranks and that their target had just slipped from radar. Their orders were peculiar: intercept and observe only, refrain from engagement. It hinted that someone in the chain feared this was no enemy aircraft. Or perhaps they had supreme certainty regarding its nature, cognizant that engagement would prove futile. By the time the jets ascended to 10,000 feet and veered northeast over the South Atlantic, the object had shifted once more, rising smoothly as an elevator to 20,000 feet, then halting yet again. At first, all of them observed a glowing sphere suspended against the dark canvas of the night sky, too steady to be a flare, too luminous to be a weather balloon, and far too fast for anything Argentina or its neighboring countries could muster. Rocha confirmed the visual. Both aircraft adjusted course towards the anomaly, their speed increasing. The sphere remained unmoving, as if watching them. Then it shifted, not with acceleration, but with instantaneous velocity. From a complete standstill, it darted eastward over the sea. The pursuit was brief. Even at full throttle, the Polki IIs could not catch up. In mere moments, the object ascended to 40,000 feet and distanced itself as if the jets were simply standing still. The cockpit radios crackled with urgency as Oliva and Rocha relayed updates. Visual lost, unable to lock onto radar, target climbing steeply. Then, it vanished. Back at Mar del Plata, the radar display revealed nothing. The object had disappeared, either too far, too high, or simply gone. The jets returned under a cloak of radio silence. The hangar was enveloped in darkness upon their landing, save for a lone administrative truck station just off the runway, waiting. Immediately separated, both pilots were escorted to debriefing rooms. Their flight data was confiscated. Maintenance crews remained outside the hangars, and unmarked personnel clad in civilian attire were spotted conferring with the base commander. Flight records for October 2nd were sealed, and the chase, which unfolded in less than 12 minutes, was never officially logged. Later that night, Romero returned to his station, only to discover that the radar tapes from his shift had already been taken. Word of the event traveled swiftly through the base, not via formal reports, but rather through an unspoken understanding. Everyone sensed something monumental had transpired, yet no one dared to inquire. They dubbed it Luk Notakabati, the light that never made contact with the earth. And so, the cover-up commenced. Lieutenant Julio Fernandez, a junior officer within the Administrative Intelligence Department at the time, maintained a handwritten journal throughout his years at the base. In a 1998 interview, long after his retirement, he disclosed that 3 days post-incident, a memo circulated mandating all references to the October 2nd intercept be categorized under non-standard training activities. The memo, stamped by Naval Intelligence, bore a classification usually designated for foreign surveillance or experimental weapons testing. Its title read, Non-Standard Aerial Encounter, Coastal Zone Tango 14. Silence was enforced. No one was permitted to discuss it again. For nearly 40 years, the Mardla incident remained buried beneath layers of secrecy, However, that changed in 2003, when journalist Mariana Rivas, scrutinizing Cold War-era radar anomalies, submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Argentine Ministry of Defense. Her initial request was denied, yet her subsequent attempt, filed under new transparency legislation, resulted in the return of a heavily redacted dossier labeled Operation Phantasma. While it was scant, it proved adequate. The document corroborated the deployment of 2 intercept aircraft on October 2, 1965, in response to an unidentified aerial vehicle. It highlighted that the object exhibited non-ballistic motion and exited radar range at an extreme velocity. The concluding assessment declared that no conventional aircraft or atmospheric circumstance could account for the target's erratic behavior. Rivas traced Teniente Rocha to Mendoza, where he was then 64 years old. For the first time publicly, he recounted their experience. They pursued something that outpaced their finest jets without any apparent effort. It had no wings, emitted no heat trail, and maneuvered as if unaffected by the laws of physics. It wasn't a balloon. It wasn't a missile. It was a where. Rocha's testimony introduced new dimensions. During the pursuit, both he and Oliva encountered static bursts in their headsets, brief, high-pitched tones that diverged from any recognizable radio frequency. They refrained from reporting the anomalies at the time, fearful of the consequences. Ordered to classify the mission as null, it was recorded as a training sortie with no operational objective. It wasn't mere training, Rocha clarified. It was a mission of surveillance, with us under scrutiny. The significance of this account extends beyond individual testimonies. It is bolstered by corroborative evidence. Civilian air traffic logs from Buenos Aires noted an unidentified object traversing the South Atlantic at an elevated altitude during that very time frame. Commercial aviators in Patagonia reported encrypted communications over the same frequencies utilized by military interceptors. Fishermen operating near Miramar recounted an encounter with a luminous star plummeting toward the ocean before inexplicably disappearing. Then surfaced an international piece of the puzzle. In 1991, a radar technician from the Chilean Air Force asserted that he had tracked the same object emanating from Punta Arenas. The object reportedly maneuvered eastward at velocities surpassing 7,000 taller cumbrata. Although he discreetly submitted a report to his superior, it led to no immediate action. However, years later, he recounted this incident to an aviation historian, depicting the object's movement as direct, devoid of sound, and purposeful. In 2012, a declassified Cold War-era memo from the United States Navy, released under joint transparency initiatives between Argentina and Brazil, emerged. Dated November 1965, it alluded to a recent aerial phenomenon noted over Mar del Plata that might be of interest to North Atlantic defense analysis. This line substantiated what many had long suspected: the United States was monitoring the skies too. Thus, if the object was neither ours nor theirs, what was it? Doubters propose explanations ranging from a weather anomaly to a misinterpreted balloon or even a satellite. Nevertheless, seasoned fighter pilots do not scramble for balloons. They do not lose sight of something drifting at 5 knots. Other theories suggest the possibility of experimental craft from either the Soviet or American repositories. Yet, during 1965, neither nation had transparently showcased any capabilities for lateral hypersonic movements or sustained silent hovering. Even in the present, such technology remains largely theoretical. What lingers are shards of insight: a classified flight, an obscured memorandum, eyewitness accounts from pilots whose perspectives shifted after that event, and radar data outlining an unexplainable entity gliding across the ocean like a shadow with intention. Captain Oliva passed away in 2017. In his last documented interview, when assessing the identity of the object, he responded with deliberation that it was not a threat, not human, and not ours. After a pause, he added that they pursued it and had guided their journey. The military engagement near Mar del Plata stands as one of the most thoroughly recorded yet suppressed aerial confrontations of the Cold War era. a moment when the distinctive line between military defense and the enigmatic blurred silently, swiftly, and without authorization. What prompts the concealment of a chase observed on multiple radars, validated by elite aviators, and supported across international borders? The underlying reason becomes apparent. Acknowledging the truth would involve more than just editing flight logs. It would compel an acceptance that we are not solitary in the cosmos. The Tuscumbia Lights, 2006. Tuscumbia, Alabama, United States. The video commenced as a typical homemade recording from a tranquil town, grainy and handheld, the camera quivering slightly, coupled with the faint hum of cicadas in the background. But the lights did not flicker. 3 orbs, radiating red-orange hues, hovered in a flawless triangular formation above the treetops behind the Carter family's residence. 1 orb drifted slowly to the left, halted sharply, and returned to position. Another dipped lower, illuminating the branches of a tall pine before ascending once more as though surveying the area. The atmosphere was unsettling, utterly silent, unlike any aircraft they had ever witnessed. 15-year-old Megan Carter stood behind the camera, confiding to her father that it was not moving like an airplane. It was merely present. Her father, Doug, a 6-year veteran of the United States Air Force, understood aircraft styles, their acoustics, and these entities did not fit that description. That particular night, July 10, 2006, marked merely the inception of a series of events. Over the following week, Tuscumbia, Alabama, unexpectedly emerged as the focal point of one of the most intriguing yet least publicized UFO flaps in the southern United States. While the incident failed to garner national media coverage, the evidence amassed by residents, particularly the footage captured by the Carter family, continues to circulate discreetly among researchers and online communities. Tuscumbia is a serene locale nestled in the northwestern corner of Alabama, not far removed from the Tennessee River. It epitomizes a town where doors remain unlocked, and the most significant annual event is the Helen Keller Festival each summer. This is not a community typically associated with UFO sightings. Nevertheless, something hovered there in July of 2006, defying earthly explanation. Once the Carter video surfaced on YouTube in the days following the sighting, it began to attract attention, not solely from intrigued viewers, but also from researchers and skeptics alike. The footage, while unrefined, was captivating. It depicted several objects lingering low above the treetops for over 10 minutes, navigating independently yet never straying too far from each other. There were no blinking navigation lights, no sounds of jets, and no answers. Local news stations aired a brief segment encompassing the clip, interviewing the Carters outside their home. Doug Carter straightforwardly stated that after years spent working around aircraft, he could assert these were neither jets nor helicopters. Uncertain of their origins, he insisted they were not ours. Encouraged by the unfolding events, neighbors began stepping forward as witnesses. A couple residing just 2 blocks away reported observing the lights on the same night from their backyard swing. A retired educator described witnessing 3 glowing dots resembling embers floating above the trees, entirely quiet. Additionally, a local sheriff's deputy, choosing to remain unidentified, relayed to a reporter that during his patrol that evening, he witnessed something extraordinary in the sky, substantial and low. He remarked on its silence and the slow manner in which it moved across the treetops. When he attempted to utilize his police radio to report the incident, the signal crackled with interference. Upon the lights vanishing, normalcy returned to his radio. Days later, another sighting transpired, this time near the Natchez Trace Parkway outside Muscle Shoals. 2 fishermen engaged in night fishing on the Tennessee River described a similar triangular formation of lights hovering above the water for several minutes before shooting upwards and disappearing altogether. One of the fishermen attempted to capture a photograph of the phenomenon, but the resulting image was blurry and overexposed, likely a consequence of either rapid movement or light glare. By the week's end, an influx of reports emerged from residents throughout Colbert and Lauderdale counties. Some of these accounts even found their way to the Mutual UFO Network, or MUF, where they were duly cataloged in their case file database. What distinguished the Tuscumbia sightings was not merely the consistency in the eyewitness descriptions, but the convergence of unique elements such as video evidence, numerous witnesses, and an array of corroborating circumstances. A retired Air Force veteran shared that he experienced electromagnetic interference during the event, coupled with the absence of any military or meteorological activities that could account for such a phenomenon. Within a fortnight of the initial sighting, investigators from MUF and independent scholars descended upon the area. They conducted interviews with the Carters and scrutinized the original video footage. Experts noted that the patterns of the lights did not correlate with the blinking sequences or thermal signatures associated with FAA-regulated aircraft. No commercial or military flights were scheduled for that evening in the altitude or trajectory observed, and radar logs acquired through requests under the Freedom of Information Act revealed nothing unusual. There were no transponder returns, no aircraft filers, and no recognizably known craft. The notion of weather balloons was swiftly dismissed, as was the idea of drones. In the year 2006, civilian drone usage was still relatively uncommon, and nothing available on the market could hover with the kind of stability or illumination exhibited that night. One independent analyst, a retired electrical engineer named Ray McCarty, meticulously analyzed the video with enhancement filters, tracking the light movement frame by frame. He concluded that the three lights consistently maintained a geometric arrangement throughout the footage, implying they were either parts of a singular structured entity or a highly coordinated trio. McCarty remarked that if it were indeed a solitary craft, then it must be enormous, silent, and capable of hovering almost motionlessly for extended durations. This behavior matched no known aircraft in his experience. Efforts to reach out to local military bases, including Redstone Arsenal and Columbus Air Force Base, produced minimal response. Officials denied any ongoing training exercises or aircraft deployment in the region on the night of July 10th. When presented with the video, one spokesperson issued a terse statement indicating that the lights did not resemble any of their assets. Doug Carter later recounted a visit from two men who claimed to be representatives of a government aviation office, requesting to view the original tape. While he allowed them to see it, he declined to relinquish the original file. Afterward, he informed reporters that the men failed to identify themselves and left no business card. They merely inquired about where he had filmed it, the direction he had been facing, and similar details. But they never disclosed their true affiliations. Doug recalled feeling uneasy about the encounter. The narrative did not spread far beyond the region, as no major newspapers expressed interest. Although the video garnered moderate attention on early YouTube, it was soon overshadowed by the deluge of viral content. For the Carters and the residents of Tuscumbia at the time, it transformed into a quiet enigma, an experience they would hold closely while the world seemed to look the other way. Years later, during a podcast interview, Megan Carter, then in her 20s, candidly reflected on the experience. She remarked that it was not merely lights in the sky, it was a sensation shared among all present. The atmosphere shifted, time appeared to slow, and there was an undeniable feeling of being observed. Her father nodded in agreement, asserting that while he did not claim to know what it was, he was emphatic about what it wasn't, which he believed was sufficient for him. Researchers still occasionally revisit the Tuscumbia lights as a noteworthy instance of a localized flap, meeting all the criteria for a credible unexplained aerial phenomenon: clear video documentation, consistent multi-witness testimonies, experienced observers, electromagnetic anomalies, and a complete absence of conventional explanations. The Carters currently possess the original footage, now safeguarded and digitized. It is not glamorous, it does not depict diminutive green beings. Yet for those who have scrutinized it, the truth resides in its unembellished nature. Three lights hovered silently, behaving in manners wholly uncharacteristic of known aviation. For those who witnessed it, the experience remained engraved in memory. Megan Carter pursued her studies, transitioned to professional life, and started a family, but the memory of that night remained vivid. She later mentioned that while it was not something she contemplated daily, there were moments when she would glimpse a plane soaring above and feel her heart race, for she knew what she had seen, and she was certain it was not a plane. Doug Carter diligently preserves the original tape, now digitized and backed up. Occasionally, a researcher makes inquiries, or someone from the town asks to revisit the footage. Each time, Doug observes their reactions, the silence that envelops them, the lengths of their gazes fixed on those three red lights. Most individuals have moved on. Tuscumbia has returned to its tranquil cadence. Yet for several summer nights in 2006, something lingered in the dark, something that did not belong to any known program, did not conform to any recognizable shape, and did not create a sound. Whether it was an interloper, a covert test, or something more arcane remains shrouded in mystery. But in the calm of a southern night, accompanied by the backdrop of crickets chirping and trees swaying gently in the breeze, the sky once cradled an enigma, and the inhabitants of Tuscumbia remained witnesses to its fleeting presence. The lead diver blinked, adjusting the fit of his mask and scanning his surroundings. He found himself not alone. 6 Soviet military divers stood alongside him, all engaged in what was ostensibly a routine training mission under the aegis of the Soviet Navy. Together, they witnessed something extraordinary, an event that would remain entombed in secrecy for decades. Lake Ball was far from ordinary. This vast expanse of fresh water, renowned as the largest in the world by volume, boasted depths that reached further than the Grand Canyon in certain areas, all encircled by the harsh, unforgiving Siberian wilderness. The local populace had murmured tales for years, speaking of peculiar lights that would emerge from its shadowy depths, entire fishing vessels disappearing without a trace, and enigmatic figures gliding across the lake's placid surface during moonless nights. Yet, as the 1980s unfolded, amidst the Cold War's heightened tensions, the Soviet military's curiosity pivoted sharply towards these phenomena. Classified documents and the accounts of former officers revealed that a specialized unit had been commissioned to delve into the occurrences subsequently dubbed swimmer encounters. Once clandestinely shielded within military archives, these reports emerged decades later, disclosed by Major General Vasily Yuramno, a Soviet military officer tasked with monitoring anomalous phenomena for both the KGB and the Soviet Air Force. Yuramno later verified in interviews that multiple naval operations had stumbled upon enigmatic underwater activities, particularly at Lake Ball. The most harrowing incident transpired during a training dive in 1982, close to the lake's western shore. 7 Navy divers descended in neat formation only to confront towering humanoid figures. Alarmed, the divers made attempts to approach. Command protocols mandated that any unrecognizable entities should be apprehended for further examination. However, that endeavor faltered. As the team surged forward, an unseen force erupted through the water. Some perceived it as a shockwave, while others recollected the sudden pressure that violently propelled their bodies backward. In the ensuing turmoil, 3 divers were unable to surface in time, tragically losing their lives. The remaining 4 endured significant injuries, grappling with decompression sickness despite adhering to their dive limits. The incident was swiftly classified. Military records attributed the fatalities to rapid ascent, resulting in barotrauma. Yet, for those directly involved, the truth was unmistakable. They had encountered something not of this earth, or, at the very least, not of human origin. In the weeks that followed, activity within Lake Ball surged. Patrol boats traversed its waters during the night, and helicopters conducted low-hover flyovers. Divers were diverted from unrelated assignments and reassigned to Lake Ball, although no further official operations ever became public knowledge. Civilian sightings persisted unabated. In 1987, a local fisherman, Alexei Timoshenko, recounted a glowing orb that ascended from the lake's surface in the dead of night. It hovered silently, radiating a bluish luminescence that danced across the water's surface before shooting upward into the sky without a sound or visible means of propulsion. At that precise moment, a scientific research vessel reported a sudden surge in energy on their instruments, though their official logs omitted any mention of the object. The following year, in 1988, residents from the nearby town of Listviana beheld several reddish-orange lights suspended above the lake. Some of these lights reportedly maneuvered beneath the water, visible even from the shoreline, regardless of the thick ice cover. A handful of intrepid individuals managed to capture photographs, yet their film reels were allegedly confiscated days later by men in plain clothes. By 1990, Russian naval personnel subtly corroborated to independent journalists that sonar had detected rapid-moving objects deep within the lake, traveling at velocities unattainable by existing submarines, some exceeding 250 kilometers per hour. These USOs, unidentified submerged objects, were frequently reported darting both vertically and horizontally, executing maneuvers no known vessel could replicate at such depths. What was even more baffling was the nature of these contacts. They appeared and vanished without an identifiable point of origin, sans seafloor bases or any geological cave systems merely emerging, exhibiting erratic movement, and suddenly disappearing. Initially skeptical, Soviet scientists began accreting environmental readings coinciding with reported sightings. Some data indicated spikes of high radiation levels in concentrated zones of the lake, which reverted to normal just hours later. The Ministry of Defense maintained its silence, while most local media steered clear of the subject entirely. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union did more insights begin to surface. Researchers from the West, including those affiliated with MUF and independent Russian UFO groups, began interviewing retired military personnel who had been stationed at Lake Ball. Many of them confirmed off the record that encounters had indeed occurred, with some hinting at directives given to avoid engagement or interference following the tragic events of 1982. One retired Soviet naval officer, under the alias Captain Mikhail, reminisced about his time near Lake Ball for submarine drills, recounting strange green lights undulating beneath the surface. They moved in flawless formation, he noted, faster than they could track. Their origins remained a mystery. They did not belong to any nation. Perhaps even more astonishing was the remarkable consistency of these accounts. Over nearly 2 decades, local fishermen, scientists, divers, and military personnel coherently described similar phenomena: swiftly moving lights, humanoid swimmers, and propulsionless crafts rising quietly from the lake's obscured depths. What could they be? Some theorized an ancient species evolved to thrive in Earth's abyssal environments, far removed from human detection. Others speculated extraterrestrial origins, using Earth's lakes and oceans as clandestine hideouts. A few scientists entertained the idea of advanced military crafts, yet no contemporary technology matched the reported agility and silent operation. Of course, skeptics proffered explanations grounded in known science: sonar malfunctions, underwater gas emissions, collective hallucinations, even bioluminescent organisms. But none of these hypotheses managed to elucidate the interplay of eyewitness accounts, sonar readings, bursts of high radiation, and tragic incidents affecting experienced divers. One of the final well-documented incidents occurred in 2009 when recreational divers exploring a southern section of Lake Ball reported witnessing a luminous disk glide silently beneath them. As a consequence of the sighting, one diver experienced temporary paralysis. This incident, however, was never subject to an official investigation. To this day, the Russian authorities have largely refrained from commenting on the BOL phenomena. No designated agency has taken charge of cataloging or responding to the numerous accounts. Residents continue to exchange tales in muted whispers. Divers now tread cautiously in the lake's profoundest depths. Lake Bal remains one of the most enigmatic bodies of water on the planet, not solely due to its ancient origins, distinctive wildlife, or remarkable geological features, but also for the potential secrets that linger within its waters. In a landscape where cameras abound and information traverses the globe in an instant, certain locations remain shrouded in silence. And some enigmas, particularly those concealed beneath layers of primordial icy tranquility, steadfastly refuse to divulge their truths. From the enigmatic skies to the obscured archives, we will return tomorrow with further revelations. Support Night Archive by liking this video and subscribing for daily updates.